She was poisoned without knowing. A mafia boss exposed the conspiracy. Dishti Basm. A doctor who saved hundreds of lives never noticed her own was being stolen, one injection at a time. For 11 months, someone has been watching Serena Vale deteriorate, measuring her decay like a clinical trial, waiting for the moment she simply stops existing. Tonight, the wrong man gets shot. And for the first time, someone finally sees what no one else did. If this story grips you, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this goes. Now, let's begin. Set. The rain had been punishing Chicago for 6 hours straight when Serena Vale ran her second red light of the night. She wasn't reckless by nature. She was, by every metric that mattered to the people who signed her performance reviews, precise, methodical. The kind of physician who triple-checked dosages and kept immaculate patient notes, and never, not once in 11 years of emergency medicine, had ordered the wrong test. But that was before the trembling started. Before the blackouts carved blank holes into her days like pages torn from a notebook. Before she'd begun waking on her bathroom floor with no memory of how she'd gotten there, tile cold against her cheek, hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the sink to pull herself upright. Tonight, the tremble was in her right hand again. She could feel it as she white-knuckled the steering wheel, her headlights cutting through sheets of rain on South Michigan Avenue, the hospital still 4 blocks away. She pressed her palm flat against the wheel and breathed through her nose. The tremor didn't stop. It never stopped anymore. It just moved. From her fingers to her wrist to somewhere deeper, like something was vibrating loose inside her that she couldn't locate or name. She was 20 minutes late for a 12-hour overnight shift, which meant Dr. Calloway would leave his passive-aggressive note on the department board, which meant the nurses who liked her would pretend not to see it. Which meant another night of proving she was fine. She wasn't fine, but she showed up anyway, because that was the only script she knew. The ER at Creston Medical was running at 140% capacity when she pushed through the ambulance bay doors, scrubs already damp from the sprint across the parking structure. The charge nurse, a compact woman named Dolores, who had been doing this longer than Serena had been alive, looked up from the board and did not say anything about the time. Trauma 2 is holding a GSW, upper thigh, through and through, Dolores said instead. The paramedics are nervous about him. Nervous how? Nervous like they don't want to know who he is. Serena pulled on gloves as she moved. That sentence alone told her more than a full intake form. Paramedics in this city had seen everything. They didn't get squeamish over gang affiliations or crime scenes. If they were nervous, it meant the patient had arrived with a particular gravity around him, the kind that came from very expensive clothes and very quiet men who had followed the ambulance in black SUVs and were now standing in the waiting area not speaking to anyone. She pushed through the curtain into Trauma 2 and stopped moving for exactly 1 second. He was large, not in the bloated way of men who'd let themselves go, but in the structural way, the way that suggested something architectural beneath the surface. The suit jacket had been cut away by the paramedics and lay in a ruined heap on the floor, charcoal wool soaked black with blood. His face was angular and still, the kind of still that either meant shock or iron self-control, and she couldn't tell yet which it was. His eyes were open, dark. Watching her the way certain patients watched, not with fear, but with the particular assessment of someone who categorized threats for a living. She approached the gurney. "Sir, I'm Dr. Vale. I'm going to take a look at your leg." He didn't answer. "Do you know what day it is?" "Saturday." His voice was low and unhurried. No slurring, no confusion. "The bullet went through clean. Nicked something on its way. I need it closed, not a production." "You don't get to decide what you need. That's why you're in my room and not your own." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense. Something more like reassessment. She examined the wound. The paramedics were right to be nervous. The trajectory was clean, but the external bleeding had been substantial, and whoever had field-dressed this before the ambulance arrived had known what they were doing. Military-grade gauze packed tight, pressure applied correctly. Not something most men did to themselves in the backseat of a car. Someone had been with him who knew field medicine, and that person was no longer here, which told its own story. "I'm ordering imaging to confirm no vascular involvement," she said. "You're going to need stitches, possibly a drain." "I've had stitches before." "Congratulations." She looked up. "Is there anyone I should notify?" "No." She held his gaze for a beat. His eyes were very dark, almost black in the fluorescent light. And they were doing that thing again, cataloging her, taking inventory. It made her skin feel strange. She looked away first, which she didn't usually do with patients, and she noticed it, and she didn't like noticing it. "Allergies?" "None." "Current medications?" "No." She began writing orders. The tremor in her right hand moved through 3 of the characters in the patient name field. She'd taken his name from the intake form the paramedics had filled in, though the ID they'd provided had the particular crispness of something very recently manufactured. She pressed harder on the pen. The shaking did not cooperate. She didn't know he was watching her hand. She didn't know he'd seen the discoloration under her fingernails, barely visible, a faint bluish-gray tinge at the base of her right index and middle fingers, the kind of thing you'd have to know to look for, the kind of thing that most physicians would dismiss as bruising, or a circulation irregularity, or the result of working overnight shifts in a cold hospital. Dominic Vescari had seen that discoloration once before, on a man who'd been dead inside 6 weeks. The imaging confirmed no major vascular damage. Serena closed the wound herself. 12 sutures, clean lines, the kind of work her hands used to do without thinking. Tonight she had to concentrate harder than she wanted to. The trembling had settled into a low-frequency hum that wasn't obvious unless you knew where to look, and she was acutely aware of it in a way that made the concentration harder, which made the trembling worse, which was the kind of loop she'd learned to step around mentally by focusing on the technical demands of the task. 12 sutures, even spacing, no complications. When she finished, she looked up to find him watching her hands again. "You're good," he said. "Yes." "But something's wrong." She stripped off her gloves. "My patient isn't a neurologist." "No, he's not." A pause. The rhythm of that pause felt deliberate, like he was deciding something. "Your right hand." The shaking. Controlled tremor. Some physicians have it, doesn't affect the work. "And the color under your nails." She went very still. She looked down at her fingers. She'd noticed the discoloration herself 3 months ago. Had mentioned it to her internist, who had attributed it to her iron supplements and told her to monitor it. She'd shown it to 2 other colleagues, both of whom had either agreed with the iron theory or suggested she was overworking. It was so faint. You'd have to be looking specifically. "What about it?" she said. He studied her for a long moment. Outside the curtain, the ER noise continued. A child crying somewhere, a monitor alarming, Dolores's efficient voice redirecting a paramedic crew. In here, it was very quiet. "Nothing," he said. "Forget I said anything." She didn't forget. She stood there for 2 more seconds than was professional, trying to read something in his face that wasn't there for her to read. And then she pulled the curtain back and walked out, because she had 14 other patients, and one of them was a 7-year-old with a head injury, and this was not the moment to unravel over a cryptic comment from a man whose last name was probably not his real name. But she didn't forget. The rest of the shift was brutal in the ordinary way that brutal shifts were. Relentless rather than dramatic. The kind of exhaustion that accumulated in the joints and behind the eyes rather than in any single catastrophic moment. By 4 in the morning, Serena was running on black coffee and the specific blankness that came after the second wind gave out. And when she went to check on her GSW patient, she found the bed empty, the monitor leads neatly coiled on the pillow, and no note, no discharge form, nothing except a very faint impression in the sheets where he'd been. Dolores, at the desk, had seen nothing. The security footage, she learned later, showed the curtain area only intermittently, due to a camera alignment issue that maintenance had apparently been meaning to fix for 3 months. In the 90-second gap where his bay was unobserved, he had simply ceased to be there. She filed the AMA departure paperwork. She wrote a follow-up note. She thought about the discoloration under her fingernails while she was doing it, pressing each key with more precision than necessary. And then she stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it led to a place she wasn't ready to go. She drove home through rain that had thinned to drizzle, second and third traffic lights obeying her for once, and was asleep before she fully remembered lying down. His name, as it was actually known to perhaps 300 people in the continental United States, was Dominic Vescari. He was 41 years old. He controlled, through a series of holding companies, intermediaries, and arrangements that had never appeared in any filed document, roughly 70% of the private security contracting network on the Eastern Seaboard, 3 port authorities, and enough leverage inside the Chicago commodities market that certain brokerage firms had standing instructions to call a specific number before they made particular trades. He was not technically a violent man, or rather, violence was one instrument among many, deployed when precision required it rather than as a default. Men who had worked for him for decades sometimes said he was the most methodical person they'd ever encountered. Men who'd worked against him said nothing, because working against him tended to produce outcomes that precluded future commentary. He sat in the back of a black Escalade at 4:50 in the morning, his sutured thigh throbbing at a frequency he was choosing to ignore, and he told his head of intelligence, a skeletal man named Ruiz, to find everything there was to find about the doctor, the ER physician. Her full name is on the paperwork. He'd memorized it from the intake form. Serena Vale, Creston Medical. She's been there 11 years. Ruiz didn't ask why. That was one of the reasons Dominic kept him. How deep? Medical history, financial history, employment history, family connections, anyone who's been in her orbit for the last 2 years. Dominic looked out the rain-streaked window at a city that was mostly asleep. And find out where she gets her medical care, specifically whether she has any recurring treatments, anything regular. Ruiz wrote it down. Timeline? 72 hours. He paused. Prioritized the medical care records. The car moved through streets still slick with rain, and Dominic leaned his head back and thought about the color under Serena Vale's fingernails, and the precise, controlled way she had moved despite the tremor in her hand, and the fact that she had been suffering for months, and no one around her had thought to look at the most obvious physical evidence on her own body. He'd seen that discoloration in 2009 on a man named Gregoire, who had owed money to the wrong people and had declined to pay it. Gregoire had presented to his personal physician 4 times with symptoms that were variously attributed to stress, overwork, and low iron. He'd been dead within 6 weeks of the first symptom appearance. The compound used on Gregoire was called thallium acetate derivative, modified for delayed toxicity. It had been used twice in the criminal world, to Dominic's knowledge. Once on Gregoire, once on a politician whose death had been ruled natural causes. Both times it had been administered through something the target ingested or absorbed regularly. Both times the delivery vehicle had been something the target would never think to question. Thallium accumulated in the nails and the hair before anywhere else. By the time it showed up externally, it had already been circulating in the bloodstream for months. He thought about Dr. Vale's hands, the precision of her sutures, the way she'd held herself together through what was clearly a shift she shouldn't have been working. He thought about how close she was to the timeline. He told Ruiz to make it 48 hours. Serena had a standing appointment at Halcyon Wellness every Thursday at 6:15 in the evening. She'd been going for 14 months. Her internist, Dr. Preston, had referred her there after she'd mentioned persistent fatigue during a routine physical. Halcyon was the kind of place that didn't advertise, so you came by referral only, you paid out of pocket because their services weren't coded to anything insurance companies recognized, and you sat in a waiting room that looked like a boutique hotel lobby and felt vaguely guilty about being the kind of person who went to places like this. Serena had felt guilty the first time. After that, she'd stopped feeling anything about it, except the pragmatic relief of thinking she was doing something proactive about the exhaustion. The weekly treatment was an IV vitamin infusion, a proprietary blend the clinic called the Revive Protocol. Vitamin C, B-complex, magnesium, zinc, a proprietary amino acid mix that the clinic's documentation described as immune supportive. She'd asked to see the compound breakdown twice. Both times she'd received a brochure that was very attractively designed and contained no information she could actually verify. She'd almost asked a third time, about 4 months ago, and then she'd been too tired to follow through on it. She almost always felt worse after the sessions than before. She'd mentioned this to Dr. Preston, who had explained that detoxification protocols sometimes produce temporary fatigue increases and that she should stay hydrated and give it more time. She'd given it more time. She'd given it 14 months. Cut. Ruiz sent the preliminary report in 31 hours. Dominic read it in the back of a different car. He rarely used the same vehicle twice in a week, a habit so deeply embedded at this point it was reflexive rather than calculated. He read the report twice, slowly, and then he sat with it for a long time while the city moved around him. Serena Vale, 38, emergency physician, unmarried, no children. Parents both deceased. Father, a structural engineer, had died of a stroke when she was 22. Mother, a former music teacher, had died of ovarian cancer 3 years ago. No siblings. Extended family minimal and geographically dispersed. She had one close friend she met for lunch approximately twice a month, a colleague who had left Creston Medical for a hospital in Minneapolis 18 months ago. She had a cat named something that Ruiz had apparently found in a vet record and included without irony. Her health had begun deteriorating 14 months ago by the medical record indicators, a pattern of increased physician visits, escalating symptom complexity, multiple specialist referrals, all of which had returned inconclusive results or benign diagnoses. 14 months ago was when she'd started the Halcyon Wellness infusions. The clinic itself was clean on the surface, fully licensed, state-inspected, unremarkable, founded 7 years ago. Clientele was wealthy and discreet, the kind of people who paid premium prices for the impression of bespoke medical care without requiring their providers to explain the biochemistry. The medical director was listed as Dr. Alana Fox, a licensed internist whose credentials checked out. But the ownership structure was where it got interesting. Halcyon Wellness, LLC, was owned by a holding company called Brynwood Health Solutions. Brynwood Health Solutions was incorporated in Delaware, which was not remarkable. Its principal shareholders were another LLC, which pointed to a Cayman Islands entity, which pointed to a corporate board that existed on paper in 3 different countries, and functionally resolved to nothing, except that one of the board members, a silent member, a name buried 4 layers deep in the corporate architecture, was listed as an advisor to Mercer Biopharmaceutical Group. Dominic stopped reading and looked out the window. Mercer Biopharmaceutical was publicly traded, internationally respected, and currently the subject of exactly 0 criminal investigations. Its CEO and public face was Dr. Lucienne Mercer, who appeared regularly in technology and medical innovation publications, who had given a keynote at Davos 18 months ago, who was the kind of man whose reputation was an architectural structure, built deliberately, maintained expensively, and designed to make the space beneath it invisible. Dominic had never done business with Mercer. He'd been aware of him the way you were aware of weather systems that were moving in directions that didn't intersect yours. He thought about that now. About intersections. He told Ruiz to go 3 more layers down on the ownership chain and to cross-reference with the pharmaceutical company buried in Serena Vale's family history, a detail in the preliminary report that had been flagged but not yet developed. 14 months ago, her maternal grandfather's estate had been formally closed, and in the estate's assets there had been a line item about ownership shares in a dormant pharmaceutical company called Kerrigan Biomedical. Find out what Kerrigan Biomedical was, he said. Find out what it became. And find out who had reason to know that Serena Vale existed before she did. She had the blackout on Wednesday. Not the brief one she'd been having for months. The white noise moments that lasted a few seconds and left her slightly displaced, like a film with a missing frame. This was different. She was in the hospital cafeteria, a cup of coffee in her hand, mid-conversation with a resident named Park, who was telling her about a chest x-ray that was concerning him. And then she was sitting in a chair with no coffee, and the cafeteria was quieter, and Park was crouched in front of her with his hand on her shoulder saying her name with careful, controlled urgency. "Dr. Vale, Serena, can you hear me?" She could hear him. She just didn't know how long she hadn't been able to. "I'm fine." "You were standing, and then you were on the floor. I caught you before you hit your head. That was 4 minutes ago." 4 minutes. She looked at the clock. She looked at her hands. The right one was shaking again. "I'm fine," she said again, because she didn't have another answer, and the cafeteria had people in it, and she was not going to do this here. Park was young, 26, maybe 27, still in that stage of residency where the fear of missing something hadn't been entirely replaced by the cognitive shortcuts that experience built. He looked at her with the kind of unguarded concern that she usually appreciated in trainees and right now could barely tolerate. "You need a neuroconsult," he said. "Today. Not whenever you have time. I've had 3 in the last 6 months. Serena, I have a patient in 30 minutes. She stood up, her legs held. Her vision had the slightly over-bright quality that followed the blackouts, everything a little too sharp and a little too loud. But she was standing and she was oriented and she knew the date and her own name. "Thank you for catching me. Write it up as a witnessed syncopal episode and I'll see my internist." He didn't look satisfied. She walked away before he could say so. In the bathroom, she ran cold water over her wrists and stared at herself in the mirror. She'd lost 4 minutes. 4 minutes had simply ceased to exist for her. She pressed her wet hands against her face and breathed through the panic the way she'd been breathing through it for months, methodically, one breath at a time, the way you handled anything that was trying to overwhelm you. You just kept moving, because stopping meant looking at it directly, and looking at it directly meant admitting that she was genuinely frightened. She looked at her nails. She hadn't let herself look at them properly since the ER patient had said something. In the fluorescent light of the hospital bathroom, angled right, she could see it, faint, barely there, a tinge that wasn't quite blue and wasn't quite gray at the base of 2 fingers on her right hand. She'd thought it was bruising from a patient encounter 2 months ago. She'd thought it was the iron supplements. She'd thought a lot of things. She stood there for 90 seconds, and in those 90 seconds, something shifted in the way she was thinking about herself and her body, a fundamental gear change in her orientation toward what was happening to her. She'd been treating her symptoms as something that was happening to her, something internal, a malfunction. She'd been so deep inside the logic of the diagnoses she'd been given, stress, overwork, anxiety, iron deficiency, that she'd never stepped back far enough to ask the question she would have asked about any patient presenting this way. What is the source? Not what are the symptoms. What is the source? She thought about a stranger in a trauma bay looking at her hands with the precise attention of someone who had seen something he recognized. Forget I said anything. She hadn't forgotten. The text came at 11:17 that night. She was in her apartment, a notebook in her lap that she'd been using to try to map her symptom timeline against her weekly schedule, cross-referencing the days when the tremor was worst and when the blackouts had occurred and what, if anything, was consistent in her routine on those days. She'd been doing it for an hour and she kept finding the same thing. The worst days came within 72 hours of her Thursday wellness appointments. Correlation, not causation. She knew the difference, but correlation was a starting point. The text was from a number she didn't recognize. No area code she could place immediately. It said, "Don't go to your Thursday appointment. Nothing else." She stared at it. She typed back, "Who is this?" No response came for 3 minutes. Then, "Someone who looked at your hands." The notebook fell off her lap. She didn't pick it up. She sat very still in her apartment, small, orderly, the kind of space that reflected the same precision she brought to her work. Nothing out of place. Everything functional. And she felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. Her phone was in both hands and she was aware of the tremor in her right hand, and aware of the discoloration at the base of her fingers, and aware of the symptom map on the floor beside the fallen notebook, correlation points clustering around Thursday, with the horrible clarity of something that had been true for a long time before she'd looked at it directly. She typed, "What do you know?" The response came faster this time. "Enough. Don't go Thursday. Don't contact the clinic. Don't tell your doctor." Her thumbs hovered. She thought about calling the police. She thought about what she would say if she did. She thought about 3 neurologists and 2 internists, and 6 months of blood panels that had returned nothing actionable, and she thought about 4 minutes of blank nothingness in the middle of a cafeteria, and she thought about a man with very dark eyes closing a wound in his own thigh, with the kind of stillness that either meant shock or iron self-control. She typed, "I want to know who you are." This time the pause was long enough that she thought the conversation was over. She was already composing the mental language for explaining to herself why she should ignore all of this, why a stranger texting her in the middle of the night with dramatic warnings was not a reliable source of medical information, why the rational response was to put the phone down and call her internist in the morning. Then the response came. It said, "You have approximately 3 more monthly cycles before the toxicity becomes irreversible. I know what's in those injections. Meet me tomorrow." She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. The word irreversible sat in the center of her chest like something with weight. She didn't sleep. She sat in her apartment until the city outside began to gray toward morning, her symptom map on the floor and her phone in her hand, and she thought about what it meant that the most credible thing anyone had said to her about her own deteriorating body in 14 months had come from a man whose name she wasn't even sure was real. A man who had walked out of her ER in the middle of the night and was now telling her that someone was killing her slowly enough that she'd never thought to question the delivery mechanism. By the time the first light came through her windows, she had made a decision. She was going to meet him. She told herself it was the physician's instinct. Follow the evidence, trace the source. Don't stop at a comfortable diagnosis when the presentation doesn't match. She told herself it was rational. She told herself a lot of things in that gray early morning that were all true, and none of which were the whole truth, because the whole truth was simpler and more frightening. She was running out of time, and for the first time in 14 months, someone had looked at her like she might still have some. The address came at 6:42 in the morning, a warehouse district on the near south side, a specific building number on West Cermak, third loading bay from the left, 9 a.m. No name, no further explanation. Serena sat with it for 11 minutes before she got up, showered, and put on clothes that weren't scrubs. She chose jeans and a dark jacket without thinking too hard about why. Some instinct about not arriving somewhere she didn't understand in clothing that identified her immediately as a physician. She fed the cat. She drank half a cup of coffee standing over the sink and watched her right hand hold the mug and tried to gauge the tremor on a scale that had no fixed calibration because she'd been adjusting the baseline for so long. She no longer knew what steady felt like. She drove herself. She almost called her colleague Marcus, who was the closest thing she had to someone she trusted with complicated information, but Marcus was in Minneapolis, and telling him would mean explaining everything, and she didn't have the language for everything yet. She had fragments, a man in a trauma bay, a text message, a word that sat in her sternum like ballast, irreversible. She drove herself. The building on West Cermak looked exactly like what it was, a former light industrial space and a block of former light industrial spaces, most of which had been converted to the ambiguous uses that filled urban dead zones. Storage for businesses that didn't need foot traffic, off-brand logistics companies, the kind of operations that required loading bays and anonymity and nothing else. The third bay from the left was closed. She parked in front of it and sat in her car for 2 minutes with the engine running and her hand on the gear shift, running the kind of risk calculus she hadn't done since her residency, when she'd worked nights in a neighborhood where the ER took in more than it should have, and you learned fast to read the room before you committed to being in it. She turned the engine off and got out. The bay door was not fully closed. There was a gap at the bottom, deliberate, and when she knocked twice on the metal, it rolled up from the inside with a mechanical groan, and she was looking at a space that had been cleared and set up with a functionality that was at odds with its surroundings. A folding table, 2 chairs, a bank of laptops, overhead fluorescents that actually worked. 3 men she didn't recognize stood at specific points in the room with the studied casualness of people who had been positioned rather than wandered there. And across the room, standing rather than sitting, his weight distributed slightly to the left to take pressure off the sutured thigh she'd closed 12 hours ago, was the man from Trauma 2. He looked different outside the ER. Still large, still angular, still possessed of that particular quality of stillness that she'd read as either shock or self-control, and had since concluded was definitively the latter. But in the context of the hospital, he had been a patient, reduced by the gurney, by the fluorescent light, by the institutional logic of a space that processed people rather than accommodated them. Here he was something else. The room arranged itself around him in a way that rooms did around men who were used to being the fixed point. "You came alone," he said. "You told me not to tell anyone." "Most people tell someone anyway." I'm not most people. She stepped inside. Behind her, the bay door rolled back down. She didn't flinch at the sound, though it took something not to. I want to know what you know. All of it. No editing. He studied her the way he had in the ER, that inventory-taking look that she found irritating and hadn't been able to stop thinking about. Sit down. I'm fine standing. Your leg is better than mine, and I'm standing. Sit down anyway. It's a longer conversation than you're prepared for. She sat. Not because he'd told her to, but because something in the delivery of it. Flat, informational, without the patronizing undertone that usually accompanied men telling her to sit down, made it feel like a practical suggestion rather than a directive. He sat across from her. One of the three positioned men set a folder on the table and moved away. Dominic didn't open it immediately. What do you know about thallium compounds? He said. The word landed in her chest with a specificity that made her go very still. I know what they are. Heavy metal. Toxic. Used historically as a pesticide before it was banned. Rat poison. Some industrial applications. She paused. Acute thallium poisoning presents with hair loss, neurological deterioration, peripheral neuropathy. Acute. What about chronic low-dose exposure? Her mouth was dry. Slower presentation. Neurological symptoms develop over months. Fatigue, tremor. She stopped. Cognitive disruption, episodic loss of consciousness. She looked at the folder on the table and then at him. Nail discoloration. Yes. One word. She sat with it. Maze lines, she said, almost to herself. The white transverse bands that appeared on nails during heavy metal poisoning. Though in thallium cases, the presentation could also show gray-blue discoloration at the nail bed depending on the compound modification. She thought about all the times she'd looked at her own hands in the last 3 months and explained it to herself. Where? She said. The word came out flat and strange. Where is it coming from? He opened the folder. The contents were not what she expected. She'd expected medical documents, lab reports, the kind of evidence that lived in her professional world. What she was looking at was a corporate document, ownership filings, a chain of holding companies with a visual diagram that Ruiz had apparently prepared and that mapped the structure the way you'd map a circulatory system. The surface vessels large and labeled, the capillaries getting smaller and more numerous until they resolved to something at the center. Your wellness clinic, Dominic said. Halcyon. It's owned 4 levels deep by a company connected to Mercer Biopharmaceutical. She looked at the diagram. She traced the line from Halcyon Wellness LLC through Brynwood Health Solutions to the Cayman entity to the board member. The name at the connection point meant nothing to her. Mercer Biopharmaceutical, she said. I know that name. Most people do. Their CEO is Lucien Mercer. He's a medical visionary. The phrase came out with more edge than she intended. I've read his work. He published a paper on adaptive drug trial methodology 3 years ago that was genuinely impressive. She stared at the diagram. Why would Lucien Mercer want me dead? That's the second question. He turned to another page in the folder. The first question is why Lucien Mercer would spend 14 months poisoning you slowly instead of simply having you killed, which given his resources would not have been operationally difficult. The room was very quiet. One of the positioned men shifted his weight slightly. Outside, somewhere past the bay doors, a truck moved through the street. The answer to that question, Dominic continued, involves your grandfather. She looked up from the folder. My grandfather died 22 years ago. I barely knew him. His name was Edwin Kerrigan. Something moved in her memory. An old man at a distance, a funeral when she was 16, a relationship that had been strained to the point of non-existence for reasons her mother had never fully explained and that Serena had been too young to press and too busy to revisit after she was old enough. Edwin Kerrigan. She had 3 photographs of him. She had no idea what he'd done professionally beyond something in pharmaceuticals that her mother had described, with characteristic brevity, as complicated. He co-founded a pharmaceutical company, she said slowly. Kerrigan Biomedical. I know the name from the estate paperwork. Kerrigan Biomedical was bought out in 1998 by a consortium that became, after 3 mergers, the foundation of Mercer Biopharmaceutical's current research division. He paused. Your grandfather retained a small ownership stake as part of the acquisition agreement. A clause that entitled the Kerrigan estate to encrypted ownership shares that carried specific legal access rights to Kerrigan Biomedical's original research archives. She tried to think through it. A 22-year-old acquisition. The archives would be evidence, Dominic said, of illegal human drug trials conducted by Kerrigan Biomedical between 1991 and 1997, before the buyout. Trials that were never disclosed to regulators. Trials that killed people. Trials whose data was used as the foundational research underlying 3 of Mercer Biopharmaceuticals' current patent portfolio drugs, generating approximately $9 billion in revenue over the last decade. Serena stopped breathing for a moment. The ownership shares your grandfather held passed to his estate, Dominic said. His estate, which was handled by an attorney who apparently had no understanding of what he was holding, passed them to you 14 months ago as the sole living heir. 14 months ago, the exact moment her health had begun to deteriorate. Someone knew, she said. Someone has known since before the estate closed. The legal access rights those shares carry aren't monetary. They're archival. You are technically the only person with the legal standing to access and release Kerrigan Biomedical's original research records. Those records, properly released, would expose the illegal trials and invalidate the patent claims built on their data. He looked at her steadily. Mercer can't buy those rights from you because their existence has never been formally acknowledged. He can't steal them because they're biometrically coded to Kerrigan lineage under the original acquisition terms. He can't negotiate them away because you don't know you have them. Well, so he decided to wait for me to die. Slowly enough that it looked like natural deterioration. Precisely enough that by the time any physician identified the actual cause, you'd be beyond intervention. He closed the folder. You're a physician with a pattern of stress and overwork and multiple inconclusive specialist consultations. Your death would have been the end of a sad story about a doctor who pushed herself too hard. Serena sat with the architecture of it, the size of it, the patience it required, 14 months of precise dosing, of monitoring her symptom progression, of maintaining the delivery vehicle. Someone had looked at her and seen an obstacle, and then designed an elegant, invisible solution, and then simply waited. How do you know all of this? She said. I have good investigators. That's not an answer. It's the answer I'm giving you right now. She leaned forward. You walked out of my ER without discharging yourself. You texted me from an unknown number. You've compiled a corporate investigation into my medical situation that my own doctors haven't managed in 14 months. I deserve more than good investigators. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, more like a recalibration. Who I am is a complication you don't need right now. Who you are determines whether I trust any of this. A pause. The kind of pause she was beginning to recognize as him deciding something rather than formulating something. My name is Dominic Vescari, he said. She didn't recognize it. She watched his face and saw that he'd registered that, and there was something in his expression that was almost, not relief, but a kind of neutrality that wasn't possible if she'd known the name. Should I know who that is? She said. Some people would say yes. He said it without inflection. I operate in areas that aren't registered anywhere you'd look. She parsed that. Criminal. Adjacent. That's a useful word. It's an accurate one. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to trust my character. I'm asking you to look at the documents, cross-reference what you can independently verify, and make a decision about whether the evidence is credible regardless of its source. She looked at the folder. She thought about 14 months and a neurologist who'd said anxiety and an internist who'd said overwork, and a Wednesday afternoon 4 minutes of nothing in the middle of a cafeteria. She pulled the folder toward her and started reading. Well, it took her an hour and 40 minutes to get through the documents Ruiz had prepared, asking questions at intervals that Dominic answered with the same flat precision he seemed to apply to everything. 2 of his men brought coffee at some point. Real coffee. Not the institutional variety, which struck her as a strange detail to notice, and she noticed it anyway. She asked for a pen and wrote on the margins of 3 pages. She cross-referenced the corporate structure against her own memory of the estate paperwork, which she'd barely read because the attorney had told her there was nothing of significant monetary value, and she'd been in the middle of a brutal rotation and had signed what needed signing and filed the documents and not thought about them again. There was a moment, somewhere in the second hour, where the clinical detachment she'd been maintaining since she sat down developed a crack. She was reading the section on the illegal trial data, not the corporate structure, but Ruiz's summary of what the trials had involved, sourced from archived court documents in a jurisdiction where a partial disclosure had been made and then suppressed. Test subjects who hadn't been informed they were test subjects. Adverse event data that had been recorded internally and then deliberately excluded from regulatory submissions. People who had trusted that what was being done to them was being done with the full oversight of a system designed to protect them. She set the papers down and looked at the table for a moment. "How many people?" she said. Dominic didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "The documented cases are 47. The actual number is likely higher. The records that would confirm it are in the archives you haven't accessed yet." She nodded once and picked the papers back up. When she finished, she set the folder on the table and straightened the edges of the pages automatically, the same way she straightened instrument trays and patient charts. The precision of it, a reflex that had nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with the fact that her hands needed something to do. "The infusion compound," she said. "Can you get me a sample?" Dominic looked at her. "What for?" "Because I want to verify it independently. I want to know exactly what I've been given and at what concentration and for how long, and I want that from a lab that has no connection to anyone in these documents. If you go back to the clinic, I'm not going back to the clinic. I'm asking whether you can obtain a sample without me being present." A different kind of pause. He looked at her with something that might have been reassessment again. "Yes," he said. "I want it analyzed by someone I choose, not someone on your payroll." "Fair. And I want access to my grandfather's estate documents, the originals. The attorney who handled the estate is still practicing. His name is Howard Gelt. He's on the north side. I want a meeting with him." "I can arrange that." "I'll arrange it myself. I don't want you anywhere near it until I understand what those legal access rights actually entail and whether I can use them without telegraphing to Mercer that I know they exist." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "You're moving faster than I expected. Someone has been poisoning me for 14 months and I have." She checked the word in her head, held it a moment. "Limited time to reverse it. What speed were you expecting?" He almost smiled. It didn't complete, but it was there for a second, at the corner of his mouth, and it changed his face in a way she'd file away and refuse to think about. "The clinic runs deliveries on Tuesday and Friday mornings," said the man named Ruiz, speaking for the first time from his position against the left wall. "The compound is mixed on-site in a dedicated preparation room. Access requires a key card that 3 staff members hold." "Can you get into the preparation room without those key cards?" Serena said. Ruiz looked at Dominic. "Don't look at him," Serena said. "I asked you." Ruiz blinked. "Yes." "Tuesday or Friday?" "Tuesday is a lighter staff day." "Tuesday, then." She stood up. "I need 48 hours to track down Gelt and get the estate documents. Whatever you find in the preparation room, I want it sent directly to a Dr. Yolanda Chen at Northwestern. Tell her it's a compound verification request from me and that it's urgent. She'll know what to do." She picked up her bag. Both men were looking at her with expressions she couldn't fully read. Dominic, with that recalibrating quality again. Ruiz, with something that looked almost like professional respect and was slightly startled by itself. "One more thing," she said, and looked directly at Dominic. "The man who shot you last night. Who was it?" The quality of the room changed. "That's not connected to your situation," Dominic said. "I'll decide what's connected to my situation. Someone shot you outside a hospital where I work, and 12 hours later you're in contact with me about a conspiracy involving my life. I'd like to know those are actually separate things before I assume they are." A long pause, longer than the others. "His name was Carver," Dominic said. "He worked for a private security firm, one we've seen in Mercer Biopharmaceuticals' contractor records." The room went very quiet again. "So they knew you were investigating," she said. "They knew someone was. They weren't certain it was me, but they shot you anyway. Precautionary. She absorbed that. Which means they know the investigation is live, which means they may move up the timeline on the clinic. He said nothing, which was its own answer. Then Tuesday isn't fast enough, she said. Can you do tomorrow? Tomorrow is Sunday. I'm aware of what day it is. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ruiz. Tomorrow, Ruiz said, with the tone of a man revising a plan he'd already made. She drove back to her apartment the long way, taking surface streets instead of the highway, needing the additional time and the additional attention that navigating traffic required, because if she got onto the highway and had cruise control and nothing to do but think, she was not confident in what the thinking would produce. She was holding herself together with the same mechanism she'd used in the cafeteria. Forward momentum, task orientation, the next concrete thing to do. And she knew from enough years of working trauma that this mechanism was finite. At some point, you had to stop moving long enough to feel it. Not yet. Not today. She called Howard Gelt's office from the car, Saturday, so she got voicemail, which she'd expected. She left a message identifying herself, referencing the Kerrigan estate, saying it was urgent and asking for a Monday morning appointment. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that in a way she didn't examine. At home, she sat with her laptop and pulled up everything publicly available on Mercer Biopharmaceutical and Lucian Mercer. The Davos keynote. The innovation profiles. The research publications, including the adaptive drug trial methodology paper she'd actually read and found impressive, which now sat differently in her understanding. A man who had designed an elegant, invisible methodology for conducting illegal trials 20 years ago would naturally have interesting things to say about drug trial methodology. The work and the crime were the same intelligence applied to different problems. She found a photograph from a medical conference gala. A tall man in his early 60s, silver-haired, the kind of face that photographed as distinguished without requiring any effort. He was shaking hands with someone at a podium, smiling with the ease of a man who had been photographed at industry events for 30 years and had long since stopped being aware of cameras. She stared at the photograph for a while. She tried to feel something useful: rage, determination, the galvanizing clarity of having a face to attach to 14 months of deterioration. What she felt instead was a strange, exhausted flatness, like the emotional register had been waiting for this information for so long that it had quietly given up and gone elsewhere. She closed the laptop. She checked her right hand. Still trembling. She looked at the nail beds, still gray-blue at the base. She needed the compound analysis. She needed the estate documents. She needed to understand the legal standing of the ownership shares before she made any move that could be perceived as threatening from Mercer's side. What she did not need, she told herself, was to fall asleep at 9:30 on a Saturday night while reading about a man who had been slowly killing her with institutional patience. She told herself this firmly and woke up on the couch at 4 in the morning with the light still on and her phone in her hand. There was one text. Dominic. Carver had a partner. Partner made contact with someone inside Creston Medical tonight. We intercepted the communication. They're verifying your shift schedule. She sat up. They want to know when you're alone in the hospital. Her fingers were already typing. Why? 3 minutes. Then, because dead in an ER after a medical episode is cleaner than whatever comes next if we move on the clinic. They're changing the method. She stood up. The cat wound around her ankles. She stood in the middle of her apartment at 4 in the morning and felt the full weight of it for the first time without the forward momentum to deflect it. The specific, cold, concrete reality that someone had decided she needed to stop existing and had been patient about it and was now becoming less patient. She typed, "Who is the contact inside Creston? We don't know yet." Someone in her hospital, someone who walked the same hallways, used the same break room, knew her schedule well enough to share it with a person connected to the man who had been slowly poisoning her for 14 months. She typed, "I need to know before I go back in. I know, working on it." She put the phone down and stood in her apartment and looked at a life that had been, until 14 months ago, ordered and functional and entirely hers, and felt the shape of what was being done to her with a clarity that was past fear and past anger, and into something that had no comfortable name. Something harder. Then she picked up the phone again and typed, Don't take Tuesday. Take tonight. A long pause. Long enough that she thought she'd pushed too far. Then, that's not enough time to... I know. Do it anyway. Another pause. I'll call you at 6 a.m. She didn't go back to sleep. She made coffee and sat at her kitchen table and mapped every person in Creston Medical who knew her overnight shift schedule well enough to share it, and the list was longer than she wanted it to be. And one of the names on it was a person she'd trusted for 8 years, and she didn't know yet which one it was. And the not knowing felt worse than any of the rest of it. Outside her window, Chicago moved through the last hours of Saturday night, the city doing what cities did, indifferent and continuous. People living their lives in the parallel universe of a Saturday that didn't contain any of what hers contained. Somewhere in that city, Lucian Mercer was sleeping. Somewhere Dominic Vescari was not sleeping. Somewhere a person she had trusted was selling her schedule to a man connected to the man who had decided her life was a problem to be solved. She held her coffee cup in both hands and felt the tremor and did not look at her nails and waited for 6 a.m. The call came at 5:50. The preparation room, Dominic said, without preamble. We're in. We have the compound. Good. Send it to, Serena. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard before, something taut under the flatness. There's something else in the room. She set down the coffee cup. What? Documentation. Handwritten clinical notes, monitoring records. A pause. They've been tracking your symptom progression, weekly updates. Whoever is overseeing this has been logging everything. Your blackout frequency, the tremor severity, blood pressure estimates they've apparently been obtaining from somewhere. Someone inside Creston. The notes, she said. Is there a name on them? A pause that lasted long enough that she gripped the phone tighter. Not a name, Dominic said. A case number. And at the top of the first page, a title. Another pause, and when he read it, his voice was absolutely level in the way that people's voices were when they were controlling something. It says, Kerrigan Succession Trial, Subject 1. She didn't say anything. Serena, I heard you. That word, trial. He let it sit. He's been running you as an experiment, monitoring how long the compound takes before the neurological damage becomes irreversible. She said it herself because she didn't want to hear him say it. He's been calibrating it, adjusting the dosage, testing the methodology. Yes. She stood up from the table. She walked to the window. Chicago below, gray-blue in the early morning light, and she stood there and breathed through her nose and let herself feel, for exactly as long as she could afford to, the full, precise, architectural horror of it. Not just that she was being killed, that she was being used. That her deterioration had been a data point, that a man who wrote respected papers about drug trial methodology had been running an undisclosed trial on her without her knowledge or consent, using a poison administered through a wellness treatment she'd trusted, monitoring her results through a contact embedded in her own hospital. The same thing he'd done to 47 documented people in the 1990s. She had been subject 1 of the next iteration. When she turned away from the window, her face had changed, and she knew it had changed, and she was done with the part of this where she was still mostly afraid. The notes, she said. Are they signed anywhere? Any initials? Any identifier? Bottom of each page, Dominic said. 2 letters. She waited. LM, he said. Lucian Mercer had been writing her death down in a notebook. I need those documents, she said. Everything in that room, every page, already out, and the compound sample, on its way to your Dr. Chen. Good. She picked up her coffee, finished it cold, set the cup down. And the contact inside Creston, we have a name. She stopped moving. It's a woman named Patricia Hale, Dominic said. She works in hospital administration, patient scheduling. Patricia Hale had worked at Creston for 11 years. She'd given Serena a birthday card last year. She'd asked once, with what had seemed like genuine warmth, how Serena was managing, the week after Serena had mentioned offhand that she was having a hard stretch. Serena stood in her kitchen in the early morning light and felt something go very cold and very quiet inside her. Don't approach her, she said. Not yet. If she knows we have her, she warns Mercer, and Mercer moves everything. Agreed. How long before Dr. Chen has results? 12 hours, maybe less if she prioritizes it. She'll prioritize it. Serena was already moving to her bedroom, opening the closet, pulling out a bag. I need to not be in this apartment when they realize no one is coming to the clinic anymore. If they've been tracking my schedule, they know I should be at work by noon. You're coming here. It wasn't quite a question. I need somewhere they don't know about, she said, unless you have another suggestion. No, he said. I don't. A brief pause and then something in his voice that was difficult to identify. Not warmth, too careful for that. Something more like acknowledgement. I'll send someone for you in 20 minutes. I'll be outside in 15. She packed the bag with the same precision she brought to everything. Efficient, functional, nothing she didn't need and nothing she wasn't sure she'd need. She put the estate documents she had in a folder. She put the laptop in. She looked at the cat and felt briefly terrible about the cat, and then texted her building super an amount of money and a request that he check on the animal, and the super, who was accustomed to her odd schedule, confirmed without asking questions. She was outside in 13 minutes. The black car that came for her had no plates she could read from her angle, and the man who opened the door for her was not Ruiz. Younger, quieter, with the specific posture of someone who'd been told to be invisible. She got in. The car moved. She looked out the window as Chicago passed around her. She thought about Patricia Hale and her birthday card. She thought about Lucien Mercer's initials at the bottom of clinical notes that documented her own destruction. She thought about 47 people in the 1990s who had trusted a system that was running them as data. She thought about the legal access rights sitting in her grandfather's estate, the invisible key she hadn't known she was carrying, the thing that had made her a target before she'd ever walked into Halcyon Wellness for the first time. She was subject one of a trial she'd never consented to. She had approximately, by Dominic's estimate, by the progression documented in Mercer's own notes, 8 weeks before the neurological damage crossed the line that the word irreversible described. 8 weeks. The car moved through Chicago towards somewhere she'd never been, and behind her the apartment she'd lived in for 7 years got smaller in the side mirror. And she thought about what kind of person she'd been before this morning and what kind she was going to have to be now. And the distance between those two things felt both enormous and oddly clarifying, like a map that finally showed you the terrain you'd been walking through without understanding it. She pulled out her phone and began drafting a message to Howard Gelt's personal email, which she'd found in the estate attorney directory at 2 a.m. She didn't wait for Monday. She sent it now, Sunday at 6 a.m., marked urgent, with her full name and her grandfather's name in one sentence that she'd thought about carefully before writing. I believe I've inherited something that someone is willing to kill me to prevent me from using, and I need to understand what it is before they succeed. She hit send. The car turned south, away from everything she knew, toward the part of the city where the rest of this was going to happen. And in the moment before she put the phone away, it buzzed with a new message from Dominic that she read once and didn't respond to, because there was nothing useful to say. It read, Patricia Hale made a call 6 minutes ago. Whoever she called will know you didn't sleep at home tonight. They'll be looking for you within the hour. The car drove on. There was no going back to the life she'd been living. There was only what came next. The safe house was on the 4th floor of a building in Bridgeport that had no sign on the exterior and no name on any mailbox, and a front door with 3 separate lock mechanisms that the young driver worked through with the automatic fluency of long practice. Inside, a converted loft, industrial bones, functional furniture, the kind of space that had been arranged for utility rather than comfort. 2 workstations, a kitchen that was stocked with the basics and nothing else, blackout shades on every window, all of them drawn. Ruiz was already there. He looked at Serena when she came through the door with the same slightly startled professional respect she'd seen from him in the warehouse, and she didn't acknowledge it because she needed to focus, and the only way she knew how to focus was to keep moving. Dr. Chen, she said, has she received the compound? Courier confirmed delivery 40 minutes ago, Ruiz said. She's marked it priority. I need her direct line. He wrote it on a piece of paper. She noticed that the analog instinct, no texts, no digital trail, and filed it away as information about the kind of operation she'd walked into. Dominic was at one of the workstations. He looked up when she came in and looked at her face and said nothing, which she was grateful for. There was a version of this situation where a man said something calibrated to acknowledge what she was going through, and she would have found it unbearable. She sat down at the second workstation and called Yolanda Chen. Yolanda picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been expecting the call, which meant she'd looked at the sample and had already formed an opinion. "Serena," she said, and her voice had the quality of a physician choosing words with surgical care. "Where are you?" "Safe." "What did you find?" A pause. "I need you to tell me where this sample came from." "Yolanda, I'm serious. Before I say anything else, I need context." Serena looked at the blackout shade on the window nearest her. "It's from a wellness clinic on the north side. It's the compound from an IV infusion protocol I've been receiving weekly for 14 months. Silence on the line. A different kind of silence than the professional pause. This one had weight. "Serena, I'm looking at thallium acetate derivative in a lipid-soluble carrier compound. The lipid carrier is designed specifically to slow absorption and extend the half-life of the active agent. This isn't a controlled exhale. This isn't something you find in a wellness clinic by accident. Someone synthesized this. The lipid carrier modification is sophisticated. Whoever made this knew exactly what they were doing and specifically designed it to be difficult to detect in standard tox panels." Serena had known. She'd known since the warehouse, but hearing it from Yolanda, from a toxicologist she trusted, in the flat clinical language of confirmation, produced a physical response she hadn't predicted. Something loosened in her chest and then immediately tightened into something harder. "What's my exposure level?" she said. "Based on the compound concentration and assuming weekly administration over 14 months, Serena, I need you to come in. I need to run a full panel. We need to start chelation as soon as possible." "I can't come in right now." "You cannot wait on this." "I know. I'm working on eliminating the source first. How long do I have before the neurological effects become irreversible?" A long pause. "That depends on your current accumulation level, which I can't determine without blood work. If the dosing has been consistent, 6 to 8 weeks before we'd be looking at permanent peripheral nerve damage. Possibly less. The cognitive effects may 6 weeks minimum. That's not a guarantee. It's a working timeline." She wrote it down. Her hand was steady. She noticed that and filed it away. Something about the shift from fear to forward motion that quieted the tremor. "I'll come to you the moment it's safe. I need you to hold the compound sample and your analysis and not discuss this with anyone. Serena. Yolanda. Please." Another pause. "I'm also running a full characterization. There's a secondary component I want to identify. I'll have complete results by tonight. Send them to this number." She read out a number Ruiz had written below the direct line. A clean phone, she assumed. "Thank you." She ended the call and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. 6 weeks. It was enough. It had to be enough. "The estate attorney," she said to the room. "Gelt. Any response?" "Email came back 20 minutes ago," Ruiz said. "He's willing to meet today." He sounded... A pause. "Alarmed." "That's appropriate. Set it up for this afternoon." She turned to look at Dominic. "I want to be there." "That's not... I'm not asking." She held his gaze. "Those are my documents. That is my inheritance. Whatever legal architecture my grandfather built around it, I need to hear it directly. Not summarized." Dominic studied her for a long moment. "They're looking for you. They're looking for my apartment and my hospital. They don't know about Gelt yet because they don't know I know about the shares." A beat. "We go in a vehicle they haven't seen. You stay covered on the way in and out." "Fine." He turned back to his workstation, and she turned back to hers, and for 20 minutes the room was quiet except for keyboards and the muffled sound of Bridgeport outside the blackout shades. She used the time to map what she knew against what she needed, building it in a structured outline the way she built differential diagnoses, symptoms to causes to mechanisms to interventions. The outline was clean until she got to the section on the internal contact at Creston, which had a branch point she couldn't close. Patricia Hale had worked at Creston for 11 years. She'd been recruited, or coerced, or both, to share scheduling information. But scheduling information was logistical. The monitoring notes Dominic's people had found in the preparation room included blood pressure estimates and symptom severity assessments that required clinical observation. That was not something Patricia Hale could provide from an administrative office. Someone else inside Creston was watching her in the clinical environment. She wrote that down and stared at it. The monitoring notes, she said. The clinical observations. Blood pressure estimates, symptom assessments. Hale is in administration. She can't get that. Ruiz looked up. He and Dominic exchanged a look she caught the edge of. We identified Hale from the communication intercept, Ruiz said carefully. We didn't assume she was the only contact. So there's a second person. Possibly. A clinician. Someone with patient access. She thought about the ER. About the people who moved through her professional environment daily. Residents, nurses, attendings. The complex population of a busy hospital department. Which means the clinical notes were being compiled by someone who could observe me without it being unusual. She thought about Dr. Park, crouching in front of her in the cafeteria, his hand on her shoulder, his careful, unguarded concern. She pushed the thought away because it was the kind of thought that, once admitted, required evidence to dismiss rather than suspicion to sustain, and she wasn't going to go down that road without something concrete. She was still thinking about it when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. Not Dominic's clean line, not Yolanda, a number with a Chicago area code that was not in her contacts. She looked at it, looked at Ruiz. Can you trace this? He was already moving. She answered. Yes. Dr. Vale. A man's voice, measured. The particular measured quality of someone who had decided how this conversation would go before he made the call. My name is Dr. Lucien Mercer. The room went absolutely still. Ruiz froze. Dominic turned in his chair. Serena's hand tightened on the phone, and she made herself breathe at a normal rate. How did you get this number? The same way I've gotten most information I've needed over the last 14 months. Efficiently. A pause. Not the calculating kind, the performative kind, the pause of a man who wanted her to feel the weight of his access. I understand you've had an eventful morning. What do you want? To be direct with you, because I think you're a person who responds better to directness than to theater. The voice was calibrated, warm without being warm, reasonable without being reasonable. The register of a man who gave keynotes to rooms full of people who respected him. You've come into possession of some information that has alarmed you, understandably. Some of that information is accurate. Some of it has been curated, let's say, by people who have their own interests in how you interpret it. You've been poisoning me for 14 months. A brief pause. That's a characterization? No, it's a compound analysis from a board-certified toxicologist. A longer pause. Something shifted in the register of his voice, not alarm, more like the minor recalibration of a man updating a model. You've been more productive this morning than I expected. What do you want? I want you to understand something before you make a decision you can't unmake. His voice settled into something that was almost professorial, like he was explaining a difficult concept to an intelligent but uninformed student. The research your grandfather's company conducted in the 1990s was ethically complicated. I won't pretend otherwise, but the outcomes of that research, the pharmacological developments built on its data, have been directly responsible for extending the lives of over 2 million people in the last decade. The drugs in question treat conditions that had no effective intervention before that research existed. You killed people to make drugs that saved people. The subjects who experienced adverse events received compensation through "you killed people," she said again, and her voice was very quiet and very clear. And then you buried it. And then you built a pharmaceutical empire on the buried bodies, and now you are trying to kill me because I inherited the legal mechanism to expose that. Is that an accurate summary? Silence. I'm going to offer you something, Mercer said, and the professorial warmth was gone now, replaced by something flatter and more honest. A significant sum, structured as a medical research endowment in your name, enough to fund the kind of community medicine work I understand you care about for the next 30 years. In exchange, the ownership shares your grandfather held are transferred to a trust I control, The archive access rights are permanently retired, and we conclude this chapter. You want me to take money to stay quiet about 47 people? The documented number is an overestimate made by... I've read your monitoring notes, Dr. Mercer. She said his name and title with a deliberateness that had nothing respectful in it. The ones with your initials at the bottom, the ones that describe me as Subject 1 of the Kerrigan succession trial. A beat. You ran me as an experiment. You adjusted the dosage. You logged my deterioration. Is that the methodology you discussed at Davos? The silence this time was different. Longer. She heard him breathe. Think carefully, he said, and the warmth was entirely gone now. About the position you're in. You're hiding in a location provided by a man whose organization has been under federal surveillance for 6 years. Any evidence you bring forward will be examined in the context of its source. A conspiracy claim made by a physician with documented neurological symptoms, corroborated by materials obtained through criminal trespass, presented in association with Dominic Viscari. He let that sit. You understand what I'm describing. She understood exactly what he was describing. The offer is open until 8 p.m. tonight, Mercer said. After that, the situation becomes more complicated for everyone. He ended the call. Serena set the phone down on the table. She looked at her hands. The tremor was back in the right one. Not the controlled low-frequency hum, but something sharper, reactive. She looked up at Dominic. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. He said, "You've been under federal surveillance for 6 years," she said. Yes? Is that accurate? Yes. She held his gaze. Which means any evidence I bring forward gets examined through the lens of where it came from and who helped me get it. That's a problem we knew existed. You knew. I didn't. She stood up. The sharpness in her voice surprised even her. Not the controlled flatness she'd been maintaining, something with actual heat in it. You brought me into this. You put me in a safe house. You had your people break into a medical clinic. And the entire time, any legal action I take with what we find is potentially tainted because of your involvement. The compound analysis came from your toxicologist, Dominic said. That's clean. The compound sample came from a break-in. The clinical notes, also from the break-in. He didn't argue with that because there was nothing to argue. He looked at her steadily and she looked back, and the silence had a specific texture to it. Not hostile, something more complicated. The texture of two people calculating the same problem from different directions. He's going to move, she said. Tonight or tomorrow morning. He called to buy time and to assess what we have. I know. Ruiz. She turned. The trace on that number. Burner, routed through 3 relays. We're still working on the origin point. He's in the city, she said. He didn't fly in for this. He's been in the city, monitoring the situation personally. She was thinking out loud, the same way she thought through a diagnostic problem, following the logic of behavior. He's here because the situation escalated faster than he expected. Carver was a precaution and it failed, and now he's here to manage it. She looked at Dominic. Where does Mercer stay when he's in Chicago? We don't have confirmed... Then find out. She moved to the workstation. He made that call from somewhere. He has to sleep somewhere. He has staff with him. You don't manage an operation this size alone. She was pulling up her laptop. And if he's offering me a deal at 8 p.m., it means he thinks he has enough time to execute an alternative if I refuse, which means the alternative is already staged. What alternative? Ruiz said. She looked at him. Me. In a hospital. Having a medical episode consistent with my documented neurological history. Except this one doesn't end with me waking up on the cafeteria floor. The room was quiet. He's going to try to finish it tonight, she said, whether I take the deal or not. The deal is a diagnostic tool. He wanted to hear my voice, assess what I know, determine whether I'm manageable. She thought about the call, the specific points where his voice had shifted. I told him about the compound analysis and the monitoring notes. That's more than he expected me to have, which means the probability that he honors any agreement is close to 0. Dominic said, We need to move you again. Moving me doesn't solve the problem. He has a contact inside Creston who can verify I haven't come in. He'll know I'm not accessible at the hospital. He has Patricia Hale, who can tell him my apartment is empty. She stopped. He has someone else inside Creston, a clinician. That person is either going to be used to set something up, or they're going to be eliminated as a loose end. Something crossed Dominic's face. Which colleague do you suspect? I don't know yet. I need the clinical profile from the monitoring notes, what symptoms were being tracked, and from what vantage point. That tells me who has the access. She looked at Ruiz. Can you get me those notes? The full document, not the summary. Ruiz pulled a file from a drawer, say, physical copies, she noticed, consistent with the analog caution she'd observed before, and set it on the table. She read through the clinical monitoring notes in 16 minutes. They were methodical and observational, the detached, precise language of clinical documentation that she recognized from her own patient notes, which made reading them viscerally strange. She was the patient and the physician simultaneously, reading someone else's record of her own deterioration. The observations were detailed enough to require proximity. Tremor severity assessments on specific days, blood pressure readings, cognitive function notes that reference specific patient interactions, her response time on a particular case, her word retrieval in a specific conversation. These weren't observations from across a cafeteria. These were from someone who had professional reasons to be close to her and clinical training sufficient to document what they saw. The notes covered 18 months. They started 2 months before she'd begun the halcyon infusions, which meant the monitoring had begun before the poisoning. She stopped reading and looked at that fact directly. The monitoring had begun before the poisoning. Someone was watching me before they started dosing me, she said aloud. Ruiz, who had been reading over her shoulder, said, baseline documentation. They established a baseline before beginning the compound administration. That requires 18 months of access to my clinical environment. She turned the page. This level of detail, this consistency. This isn't a contact they recruited after the fact. This is someone who was already embedded in my professional life. She looked at the earliest entries, 2 months before the infusions began. That was 20 months ago. I need to think about who entered my professional environment in the last 2 to 2.5 years. She thought about it. The ER turned over residents in cycles, new cohorts arriving, rotating out, a continuous churn that she usually navigated without paying particular attention to faces until they distinguished themselves clinically. Nurses were more stable, longer tenure. Attending physicians rarely moved. Administrative staff were nearly invisible in her daily experience. She went through it systematically. Who had joined Creston's ER department or moved into regular contact with her in the window between 22 and 20 months ago? She stopped. 18 months ago, a new attending physician had joined the emergency department. Dr. Conrad Hale. Conrad Hale. Patricia Hale. She set the monitoring notes down very carefully. Ruiz, she said, and her voice had gone very flat. Patricia Hale in hospital administration. What's her relation to Dr. Conrad Hale in the emergency department? A beat of silence. Ruiz typed. The sound of the keyboard was very loud in the room. Married, Ruiz said. 12 years. She stood up from the table. Conrad Hale had arrived at Creston 18 months ago as a lateral transfer from a hospital in Denver. He was technically competent, unremarkable, the kind of attending who didn't draw attention in either direction. Not brilliant, not problematic. He had worked alongside her in the ER for a year and a half. He had been present at, or arrived shortly after, several of her worst symptomatic episodes. He had once, she now remembered with a precision that felt like a physical blow, taken her blood pressure during what he'd characterized as a routine wellness check during a slow shift, explaining with friendly casualness that he'd noticed she looked tired. He had clinical training, clinical access, a wife and patient scheduling who could track her hours, and 18 months of close proximity. She looked at Dominic and felt the specific cold clarity of a diagnosis arriving too late to prevent the damage it explained. He's not a loose end, she said. He's the primary field asset. He's been there since before the poisoning began. She picked up the monitoring notes again, reading the earliest entries with the new key, the observations making sudden, terrible sense. He watched me for 2 months to establish whether I was going to discover the inheritance on my own. When the estate closed and I didn't react, They decided I didn't know what I had. That's when they started the infusions. She put the notes down. Conrad Hale is the one who will be sent to finish this if Mercer decides the deal is off. He doesn't have access to you here, Dominic said. No. But if they can't reach me, they'll do something else. She looked at the workstation, at the files, at the physical map of the situation she'd been building since this morning. They'll destroy the archive access. If they can't kill me in time, they'll find another way to invalidate the legal standing of the ownership shares. Without the shares, I have the compound analysis and the monitoring notes, and nothing else. And Mercer already told me exactly how he'd discredit those in a legal context. The shares are in the estate documents, Dominic said. Gelt has the originals. Then they'll go to Gelt. She said it, and the room went very still, and she looked at Dominic, and he was already reaching for his phone. He called Ruiz's second, a man named Torres, and gave him an address and a single instruction: get to Howard Gelt's office and don't let anyone in or out who wasn't already there. He was already moving toward the door when Ruiz said, "Dominic." Something in the way he said it. Dominic stopped, turned. Ruiz was at the workstation, his face doing something careful and controlled that she'd come to read as his version of alarm. Torres isn't answering. Silence. I sent him to Gelt's office 40 minutes ago, Ruiz said. Routine surveillance, before we knew about the second contact. He tried the number again, held the phone to his ear. He's not answering. Dominic said, "Send Keene and Devereaux. Now. Already." Ruiz stopped. His face changed. Gelt's office line is busy, has been busy for the last 22 minutes. Serena picked up the monitoring notes and her laptop in her bag with the efficiency of someone who had stopped waiting to know whether things were bad and had simply accepted that they were. We need to go. If Torres is... We need to go right now. She looked at Dominic. They anticipated the estate documents. They've been ahead of this piece since before this morning. We go to Gelt directly, or we lose the shares. And without the shares, we have nothing that can't be discredited. Dominic moved. She followed. In the stairwell, she heard Ruiz behind them, his voice tight and low, directing people she couldn't see to positions she didn't know. The logistics of his world operating at a speed and in a register entirely outside her experience. The car was in the building's interior garage, and the driver, not the young quiet one, a different one, older, with the specific posture of someone who had done this under genuinely bad conditions, had it running before they reached it. They were moving through the streets of Bridgeport within 90 seconds, and Dominic was on a separate phone, and Serena was sitting behind the driver watching the city go past and running the map of the problem in her head with the same methodology she used on complex cases. The ones where 2 or 3 things were critically wrong simultaneously, and you had to decide which one killed the patient first. The shares were the legal instrument. Without them, nothing else was actionable. The compound analysis was the medical evidence. Without it, the poisoning was undocumented. Yolanda Chen had the compound analysis. If Mercer knew about Yolanda, she dialed Yolanda's direct line. 4 rings. Voicemail. She dialed again. Voicemail. She said to Dominic, "Yolanda Chen isn't picking up." He relayed it to Ruiz without a word 2 seconds later. "Someone to Northwestern, Chen's lab, now." She tried Yolanda again, and on the 3rd try, it went straight to voicemail without ringing, which meant the phone was off or dead, and she lowered her phone and looked at her hands and found that the tremor was completely still, which told her something about the relationship between fear and clarity that she would have found interesting in a different life. The car moved through Chicago. They were 12 minutes from Gelt's office in the Gold Coast. At the 8-minute mark, Dominic received a call. He listened for 11 seconds, said nothing, and ended it. She looked at him. "Torres is in the hospital," he said. "Someone hit him in the parking garage outside Gelt's building. He's alive." A beat. "Concussion. He managed to call in before losing consciousness." "And Gelt?" Dominic was quiet for 2 seconds. "We don't know." She looked out the window. The city was entirely ordinary outside the glass. A Sunday, people on sidewalks, brunch lines outside restaurants. the unremarkable continuous life of a city that had no idea what was happening inside this car. She looked at it and thought about what it meant if Gelt was already gone, already reached. If the estate documents had been accessed or removed or destroyed in the time between her email at 6 a.m. and right now. She thought about the monitoring notes and the compound analysis and the 18 months of clinical observation and the 47 documented people and the $9 billion and the word irreversible and the 8 weeks. She thought about what Mercer had said on the phone. The situation becomes more complicated for everyone. If they have Gelt, she said, and her voice was completely level, and they destroy or invalidate the archive access, what do we have left? Dominic said nothing for a moment. Then, the monitoring notes, the compound analysis. If Chen is... The compound analysis proves I was poisoned. It doesn't prove who did it or why. Without the archive access, there's no connection between the poisoning and the illegal trials. Without that connection, it's a wellness clinic that administered a dangerous compound, a crime, but a prosecutable one that has nothing to do with Mercer Biopharmaceutical. She turned to look at him directly. He walks. We have the corporate ownership trail. Circumstantial without the archive access to establish motive. His lawyers dissolved that in a week. She turned back to the window. The archive is everything. If those documents are gone, the car stopped. Not at a light, not at a crosswalk. It stopped in the middle of South Indiana Avenue with a suddenness that wasn't mechanical, and the driver said quietly and without inflection, "We have a problem." Ahead of them, 2 cars had positioned across the street in a way that was not accidental. Black vehicles, no plates visible, engine running. 2 men stood between the cars with a particular stillness that she recognized now. The same stillness Dominic had, the same positional deliberateness she'd seen in the warehouse. But these were not Dominic's men. Behind them, she heard rather than saw a third vehicle pulling close. Dominic said something to the driver in a low, rapid voice. The driver nodded once and put the car in reverse and began moving backward with a control that suggested he'd practiced this, which was the most terrifying thing she'd seen all morning, which was saying something. Her phone rang, the same number as before. The burner Mercer had called from. She answered it because she understood suddenly, with complete clarity, that this was the part of the situation that Dominic's organizational resources and her medical knowledge and the compound analysis and the estate documents altogether had not accounted for. The part where a man with effectively unlimited private security resources simply put people in the street. "I see you left the safe house," Mercer said. His voice was the same, measured, the performed warmth entirely gone now, replaced by something professionally cold. "That was faster than I expected. You're more resourceful than the monitoring indicated." The car was still moving backward. The men between the 2 vehicles ahead hadn't moved. "The offer I made this morning is no longer available," Mercer said. "I want you to understand that this is not a personal decision. You've made choices this morning that have removed the possibility of a clean resolution." "You were never going to honor it," she said. "Probably not," he agreed, with a kind of honesty that was more chilling than the alternative. "But the offer was real in the sense that it represented a preference. I prefer clean resolutions. This one will be messier." A pause. "Dr. Hale is currently at Creston Medical. He's prepared to document a severe neurological event in your patient record, one consistent with your history, whether you're present or not. By the time any legal process attempts to verify what actually happened to you, the medical record will present a very coherent narrative." She understood what he was telling her. He was telling her he was going to create the paper trail for her death before she was dead. "One more thing," Mercer said. "Your toxicologist, Dr. Yolanda Chen." The pause was almost sympathetic. "I hope she's not in the Northwestern lab right now." Serena stopped breathing for 1 second. "Because there was a gas line incident reported at the Northwestern Research Wing approximately 18 minutes ago." His voice was absolutely steady. "The building has been evacuated. The lab and all materials in it are currently inaccessible." A beat. "I want to be clear. Dr. Chen is unharmed. I'm not without limits. But her samples and her documentation are currently in a building that no one will enter for the next several hours, by which time the situation will have resolved. The compound analysis, the only clean piece of evidence she had. She looked at Dominic. He was already on the phone. She could hear Ruiz's voice coming through, rapid, and the one word she could make out was Chen, and the word after it was confirmed. Behind them, the third vehicle had stopped. Ahead, the two blocking cars hadn't moved. They were in the middle of South Indiana Avenue in a Sunday morning city with the compound analysis gone, the estate documents potentially gone, the clinical monitoring notes obtained through criminal trespass, a federal surveillance flag on every resource she'd used since this morning, and two vehicles full of private security contractors between them and where they needed to go. The driver said very quietly, "Dominic, choice point." Dominic looked at the man in front and the man behind and looked at Serena. She looked back at him with the monitoring notes in her bag and 6 weeks of functional time and a tremor in her right hand that had, for the moment, completely stopped. And she made the decision that the physician she had been before this morning would not have been capable of making. "Go through them," she said. Dominic looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he looked at the driver and gave a single nod, and the car's engine note changed, and they stopped moving backward and began moving forward. And Serena pressed herself back against the seat and held the bag against her chest and did not close her eyes, because she had decided that she was going to see everything that was coming, regardless of what it was. Because the woman who had spent 14 months not seeing what was right in front of her was finished, and whoever came next was going to have to be someone who looked directly at everything. The car accelerated toward the blockade, and behind them the third vehicle began to move, and in the bag on her lap was everything that remained of the case she was trying to build. And somewhere in the Gold Coast, Howard Gelt was either alive or he wasn't. And Lucian Mercer was in this city watching the situation resolve, and Conrad Hale was in her hospital writing a false record of her death. The gap between the two blocking vehicles was exactly wide enough if the driver didn't hesitate. He didn't hesitate. The car hit the gap at 43 miles per hour. She knew the speed because she'd watched the driver's hand on the console in the half-second before impact, and the number was there on the display. And her brain, operating with the particular hyperclarity of extreme adrenaline, had recorded it the way it recorded everything in a trauma bay. Involuntarily, completely, without editorial. The left mirror sheared off against the front bumper of one of the blocking vehicles. The sound was sharp and immediate, metal on metal, and then they were through and accelerating north on Indiana, and behind them she heard rather than saw the third vehicle attempting to follow, and the driver was already on a phone saying 2 words to someone she couldn't identify. And then he took a hard left onto a side street she didn't have time to name, and the city rearranged itself around them. "Status," Dominic said. He was looking backward. "One vehicle still with us," the driver said. "The gap was too tight for the second." "How long?" 2 minutes before they redirect." Dominic looked at Serena. She looked back. Neither of them said the obvious thing, which was that 2 minutes was not very long and they were in the middle of Chicago on a Sunday morning with nowhere specific to go that hadn't already been compromised. "Gelt," she said. "We still go to Gelt. If his office is if it's already compromised, we need to know that. If it's not, we need to be there before it is." She held his gaze. "There's no other play. Everything runs through the archive access. Without it, we have nothing that holds." He said nothing for a moment. Then to the driver. "Gold Coast. Gelt's building, indirect." The driver nodded, and the car changed direction again. And for the next 9 minutes, they moved through the city in a pattern that felt deliberate. Not random, but structured, the same way you'd approach a procedure with multiple failure points. She spent those 9 minutes doing the only thing available to her, which was thinking. The compound analysis was in a building she couldn't access. The clinical monitoring notes were in her bag, obtained through methods that could be challenged. The corporate ownership documents were in her bag, same problem. What she needed, what she had always needed, she understood now, from the moment Dominic had laid out the architecture in the warehouse, such was the original archive. The research records from Kerrigan Biomedical, the documented evidence of the illegal trials, presented through a legal instrument that was unimpeachable because it was hers by inheritance and by the specific terms of an acquisition agreement made before she was 30 years old. Everything else was scaffolding. The archive was the structure. Howard Gelt's building was a limestone-fronted mid-rise on East Delaware Place, the kind of building that housed attorneys who had been in practice long enough that their client relationships were measured in decades. The lobby had a security desk. The elevator required a key card after the second floor. Gelt's office was on the 7th. The driver stopped half a block east. She was out of the car before it fully stopped, which she hadn't planned, her body making the decision before her mind caught up, and Dominic was beside her without comment, and Ruiz, who had been in a separate vehicle she hadn't tracked until now, materialized from the direction of the building's service entrance. Torres's team is on the 4th and 6th floors, Ruiz said quietly. Building security has been, a careful pause, redirected. She didn't ask what redirected meant. She walked through the lobby with Dominic beside her and Ruiz behind, and a man she didn't know ahead, and the lobby security guard looked at them and then looked carefully at something on his desk and didn't look up again. The elevator. The 7th floor. A corridor that smelled like old paper and carpet, and the particular institutional quiet of a Sunday in a professional building. Gelt's office door was closed, light under it. She knocked. 3 times. Deliberate. A pause. Then a voice, strained and careful. Who's there? Serena Vale. You responded to my email. A longer pause. The sound of something moving, something being set down. Then the lock disengaged and the door opened, and she was looking at a man in his late 60s who had the specific appearance of someone who had been frightened in the last hour and had not yet recovered from it. He was small and precise, with the kind of face that suggested a lifetime of careful attention to detail, and right now that precision was working against him. He was too aware of everything in the room and in the corridor, his eyes moving in quick cataloging arcs. He looked at Dominic, and his eyes stopped moving. Who is... A colleague, Serena said, which was the simplest available truth. Mr. Gelt, are you all right? He stepped back from the door. They went in. The office was the kind that accumulated rather than organized, files in stacked order on every surface, a desk that had probably been clear sometime in the previous decade, bookshelves functioning as additional filing infrastructure. One of the chairs in front of the desk had been moved to face the door. He'd been sitting watching the door. Someone came, he said. An hour ago, 2 men. They said they were from a regulatory compliance office. He stopped, looked at the folder on his desk. They wanted the Kerrigan estate documents. They had paperwork. It looked correct. I told them the documents weren't on site, that I'd need to retrieve them from archive storage. He exhaled through his nose, which was a lie, but I needed them to leave. Serena looked at the folder on the desk. Are those the complete estate documents, including the original acquisition agreement with the ownership share clause? He put his hand on the folder with the specific gesture of a man who had decided something while sitting alone watching a door. I've been Edwin Kerrigan's attorney since 1987. I handled his acquisition. I wrote the clause that created those ownership shares. He looked at her directly for the first time. I knew when the estate closed that those shares were going to matter to someone. I didn't know to whom or how urgently until this morning. Why didn't you contact me when the estate closed? She said. I did, 3 times through the standard estate notification process. You signed for the documents without requesting a full review. A pause. People rarely read what they sign in estate proceedings. She thought about the brutal rotation she'd been in the week the estate closed. The attorney's office, the papers, the signature, the filing, the forgetting. The shares, she said, the archive access rights. Walk me through exactly what they are and what I can do with them. He opened the folder. His hands were not entirely steady, but the precision was still there, the careful sequential movement of a man who had organized information for 50 years. The original Kerrigan Biomedical Acquisition Agreement, Section 14, Subsection C, establishes that Edwin Kerrigan retained an encrypted, non-transferable ownership interest in all original research archives generated by Kerrigan Biomedical prior to the acquisition date. The interest is biometrically bound to Kerrigan lineage through a verification protocol established in the agreement. He looked at her. In practice, that means you can authorize release of those archives to any regulatory authority or legal body using a biometric verification that this agreement specifies as requiring a blood sample and voice print confirmation from a confirmed Kerrigan heir. Where are the archives physically located? Gelt was quiet for a moment. That's where it becomes complicated. The acquisition agreement requires that the archives be maintained in their original location for a period of 30 years from the acquisition date. He looked at the folder. The acquisition was 1994. 30 years is this year, she said. 3 months ago, they became legally transferable. Prior to 3 months ago, they had to be maintained at the original Kerrigan Biomedical Research Facility. He paused. I have reason to believe they still are, because moving them requires notifying the estate's legal representative, me, and I received no such notification. Where is the original Kerrigan Biomedical Research Facility? Gelt set a second document on the desk. An address. Industrial District south of the city, a building she had never heard of. It was purchased by the Acquisition Consortium and has since passed through several corporate transitions, Gelt said. Its current ownership traces back, he hesitated, to Mercer Biopharmaceuticals Infrastructure Holdings. Dominic, who had been standing at the edge of the room in the specific posture of a man, not trying to control a situation he didn't fully understand, and doing it with visible effort, said, Mercer has been sitting on the archives this entire time. In the building that legally had to contain them, Serena said. He couldn't move them without notifying Gelt. He couldn't destroy them without breaching the acquisition agreement in a way that created its own legal liability. She thought about it. So he left them there and decided it was safer to eliminate the person who could access them than to deal with the archives directly. That's my assessment, Gelt said quietly. She looked at the address on the document. She looked at Dominic. I need to get into that building, she said. The drive south took 22 minutes. Ruiz spent those minutes on a phone making arrangements she could hear but not fully parse. The logistical language of his world, specific and operational, people and vehicles and positions. She spent them reading the acquisition agreement section by section, understanding the biometric verification protocol, understanding exactly what she needed to do and what it would produce. Dominic spent them watching her. She was aware of it without looking at him. The quality of it was different from the inventory-taking assessment of the hospital. Less calculating, more something else she didn't have a word for and wasn't going to look for one. The men from this morning, she said, the ones on Indiana Avenue. They'll regroup. They already have, he said. Ruiz has 3 teams repositioning. We'll have about 20 minutes inside before they can establish a perimeter. 20 minutes is enough. For the biometric verification. Yes. She turned a page of the agreement. Gelt is filing an emergency injunction with a federal court contact while we're moving. If I can authorize release of the archives to a regulatory authority before Mercer's security reaches the building, the archives become an active part of a legal proceeding. He can't touch them after that. If, she acknowledged. The building appeared from the south end of the industrial corridor, like something that had been left behind by whatever the corridor had been before it became this. A 2-story concrete structure with no signage, windows at the second floor level that had been bricked in from the inside at some point. A loading dock on the south face that was padlocked, the kind of building that was maintained to be functional and no more, kept in operation because abandonment would create a tension, and operation was invisible. 2 vehicles from Ruiz's network were already at the perimeter. Men she'd never been introduced to, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who did this for reasons that weren't her business and weren't, right now, her concern. Dominic was out of the car first. She was out a half-second behind him and moving, the acquisition documents under her arm, Gelt's verification protocol memorized from the drive. The south loading dock was open by the time they reached it. Someone had been through the padlock, though she hadn't seen anyone approach it. And inside was a space that smelled like aged concrete and the particular chemical flatness of a climate-controlled environment that had been running continuously for a very long time. It was not an abandoned building. The interior was active, not in use in any observable sense. No people, no equipment running, but maintained, the lighting functional, the floor clean, the air managed. Someone had been paying to keep this building operational for 30 years, because they had to. The archive room was on the second floor. She knew from the acquisition agreement's description, a dedicated climate-controlled space of specified dimensions, northern exposure, and what the agreement called a Category 3 document preservation environment. The stairs were at the east end. They moved. Behind her, she was aware of Dominic's breathing, the slightly elevated rhythm of someone managing a physical situation with intention, the sutured thigh working against him at speed, not slowing him, but audible. She didn't say anything about it. He didn't say anything about it. Second floor. A corridor with 4 doors. Third on the left, according to the agreement's floor plan description. The door was steel. Contemporary lock, not original to the building. Someone had upgraded it. Ruiz's man stepped forward and she stepped back, and 30 seconds later, the door was open. The archive room was exactly what the acquisition agreement had described, and also entirely other, the way things were when you'd read a description and then encountered the reality. The dimensions were right, the preservation environment was right, and the scale of it landed differently in person. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall, indexed archival storage in sealed containers that bore Kerrigan biomedical identification codes. Decades of documentation in a room that had been kept at a precise temperature for 30 years because an acquisition agreement said it had to be. She stood in the doorway for 2 seconds. Then she moved to the verification terminal, which was exactly where the agreement said it would be. A freestanding unit near the entrance, designed for exactly one purpose, which was confirming the biometric authorization of a Kerrigan heir to release the contents of this room to any designated receiving authority. The terminal was active. It had been active continuously, she understood, waiting for someone who might never come. She pressed her right thumb to the pad, spoke her name and Edwin Kerrigan's name, and the verification phrase the acquisition agreement specified, which was a specific string of legal language she'd memorized in the car. The terminal's light changed. Then a voice from behind her, from the doorway, said, "Step away from the terminal." She turned. He was not what she'd expected, which was itself a kind of information. She'd been constructing Lucian Mercer from photographs, the distinguished silver-haired figure of industry profiles, the keynote speaker, the face of respected innovation. What was standing in the doorway of the archive room was a man in his early 60s who looked, in person, like someone who had spent decades being very good at controlling the environment around him and was in the specific state of a person whose control was slipping for the first time in memory. He was still composed, but the composition was the kind that required active maintenance, and she could see the maintenance. Behind him were 2 men, not private contractors in the mode of the people on Indiana Avenue. These were positioned more closely, more personally, the specific formation of men who had long experience with protecting one specific individual rather than executing a tactical operation. Between Mercer and the door, nothing. Dominic and Ruiz's people had been in the corridor 30 seconds ago. Where they were now, she didn't know. Mercer looked at the terminal, at her thumbprint on the pad, at the changed light. Something moved through his face. "You're too late," she said. "The verification requires a regulatory submission to complete," he said. "You haven't submitted anywhere yet." He was right. She had her thumb on the terminal and the light was green and the authorization was in process, but the submission, the designation of the receiving regulatory authority, required a secondary input. "Step away from the terminal," he said again. She didn't move. "What are you going to do, Lucien?" She used his first name deliberately. The same deliberateness she'd used on the phone with his title, and the same effect, the small, precise friction of not being addressed the way he expected. "There are people in this building. Any action you take here becomes evidence. Evidence that passes through the same channel as everything else you've gathered this morning." He took a step into the room. His voice had the quality of a man speaking past something. "It's unfortunate. You're genuinely skilled. The work you described this morning, the Community Trauma Center, that's real work, the kind of work that deserved to continue." "Past tense," she said. "I'm offering you a terminal resolution." He stopped moving. "Walk away from the terminal. Walk out of this building. Disappear into whatever protection Vescari is providing, because I understand he's resourceful. I will not pursue it further. The clinic is already dissolved. That was done this morning after your call. The compound is no longer being administered. Your exposure stops now, and your body will manage the existing accumulation." He paused. "You have a medical career. You have time if you're treated promptly. Take it." She looked at him and thought about 47 documented people and the word trial at the top of a monitoring report and LM at the bottom of weekly progress notes measuring her deterioration. "No," she said. He nodded once with the expression of a man closing a door he had left briefly open. He looked at the man on his right, and she understood what was about to happen and turned back to the terminal and entered the submission code. The Federal Regulatory Authority contact that Gelt had given her in the car, preloaded into her phone, and memorized the same way she memorized drug dosages, through sheer repetitive necessity. The man on Mercer's right moved. Something happened very fast that she was only partially positioned to see. A figure from her left, from a secondary door she hadn't registered as a door, and the sound of impact, and then the man was no longer moving toward her. Ruiz. Ruiz had been in the room, through a service access she hadn't clocked, and the room was suddenly in motion in ways that required her to hold completely still and keep her fingers on the terminal and complete the submission sequence, because everything that was happening around her was secondary to the submission sequence completing. The terminal chimed. She looked at the screen. Authorization confirmed. Submission received. Federal Regulatory Receipt. Case reference 7-K-IRK-2026. The archives were in federal hands, digitally imaged, transmitted, receipted in the same 30-second window that the room had been in motion. She stepped back from the terminal and turned. Mercer was against the far wall, not held there by anyone. He'd moved there himself, she thought, with the instinct of a man who'd stopped calculating and started waiting. His two men were on the floor in different states of incapacitation that she assessed quickly with physician's eyes and determined were not critical. Ruiz was bleeding from a cut above his left eye and seemed to not have noticed. 3 of Ruiz's people were in the room, filling the space with a stillness that had arrived too fast for her to track. Dominic was in the doorway. His face had the quality of a man who had just moved quickly on a sutured thigh and was not going to say anything about it. He looked at the terminal, at the change status indicator, at her face. "Done," she said. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at the terminal. He looked at Dominic. He looked at Serena, and the expression on his face was not rage and was not fear and was not calculation. It was something she hadn't expected to see there, something almost close to exhaustion, the specific exhaustion of a man who had spent 30 years maintaining a very large and very heavy structure and had just felt it begin to fall. "You don't know what you've started," he said. "I know what you started," she said. "In 1991, with people who trusted you." He said nothing. "Conrad Hale is still at Creston Medical," she said, writing a medical record. Dominic said, "Being removed from the building currently." She looked at him. "Your people." His hospital credentials were flagged to security 20 minutes ago. An anonymous complaint about behavioral irregularities. A flat pause. "Security takes those seriously on Sundays." She breathed. Her right hand was trembling again. Not the sharp reactive absence of tremor she'd had in motion, but the baseline frequency returning, the body reasserting its condition now that the adrenaline was stepping back. She pressed her hand against her thigh and felt the tremor and thought about 6 weeks in chelation therapy and Yolanda Chen, who was out of a building that had been evacuated for a gas line incident. "Yolanda," she said. "Building cleared 40 minutes ago. No structural issue. The incident report is already being walked back." Ruiz, pressing 2 fingers above his eye without apparent concern. "She's been contacted. She has everything. The compound analysis, the characterization results, the secondary component identification." Serena went still. "Secondary component. She mentioned that this morning. The results came through while we were moving. I was going to..." Ruiz looked at Dominic, then back at her. "The compound had a secondary component, not the thallium derivative. Something added in the last 3 months." She looked at him. Something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with temperature. "What kind of secondary component?" Ruiz's face was carefully controlled. "A hormonal destabilizer. Synthetic. Designed to accelerate the neurological effects of the primary compound during the final administration phase." She parsed that in the 2 seconds it took her to understand it fully. "He was finishing it," she said. "He was done with the monitoring. He was done with the trial phase." She looked at Mercer. The last 3 months. You stopped logging clinical notes and started accelerating the dosage. Mercer said nothing. The 6-week estimate, she said, more to herself than anyone. That was based on the original compound. With the accelerant, Dr. Chen's estimate with the secondary component factored is 3 weeks, Ruiz said. Possibly less, depending on the last administration date. Her last infusion had been 8 days ago. She stood in the archive room of a building that had been kept running for 30 years on legal obligation, surrounded by the documented evidence of 47 people's deaths and the institutional patience of a man who had decided she was a problem to manage. And she felt the full weight of the timeline settle onto her with the specific, grounding clarity of a diagnosis. Not 6 weeks. 3. Maybe less. She looked at Mercer and she thought about the birthday card from Patricia Hale, and about Conrad Hale's blood pressure cuff, and about 14 months of weekly infusions at a clinic that smelled like a hotel lobby, and about Yolanda's voice on the phone saying, "I need you to come in." And she made a decision with the same completeness she'd made every decision since 6 a.m. The completeness of someone who had stopped negotiating with the reality of her situation and started working within it. "I need to get to Yolanda," she said to Dominic. "I know. Now. Not after this is processed or settled or, I know." He was already moving toward the door. He stopped and looked at Mercer and at Ruiz and at the room. He said one thing to Ruiz that she didn't fully hear, though she caught the word federal, which was enough. He looked back at her. "Let's go." She moved past Mercer without looking at him. She moved through the door into the corridor and down the stairs and through the south loading dock into the afternoon light of a Chicago Sunday that had no idea what had happened inside the building behind her, and she walked to the car with her bag on her shoulder and the acquisition documents under her arm and the verified federal receipt number in her phone. And she thought about 3 weeks and about what 3 weeks meant and what it required. Behind her, from inside the building, she heard Mercer's voice, not raised, not broken, just audible through the open loading dock in the still afternoon air. And what she heard him say was not directed at her, was directed at someone she couldn't see, was the voice of a man making a phone call. She heard him say, "It's over." And then something else, lower, that she didn't catch. She got into the car. Dominic got in beside her. The door closed. "He's calling someone," she said. "Yes." "Who?" Dominic looked at her with an expression she read in approximately half a second, and felt land somewhere in her sternum with a weight she hadn't expected. "Not all of them came from Mercer's side," Dominic said, and his voice had a quality she had not heard from him before. Not the flat precision and not the recalibrating assessments, but something tighter, something that was sitting on something else. "The men on Indiana Avenue this morning, the team that hit Torres, those weren't Mercer's contractors." She looked at him. "Whose were they?" He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "Mine," he said. "Former. People I cut loose 18 months ago when I restructured. People who've been looking for leverage ever since." He held her gaze. "They've been tracking my movements for 6 weeks, not because of Mercer, because of me." A pause. "They saw an opportunity to take something I was protecting and use it against me." The car wasn't moving yet. "Why?" she said, and her voice was very quiet. "Are you telling me this now?" "Because Mercer just called the man who leads them." His jaw tightened slightly. "His name is Ellery, and Ellery doesn't know the archives are submitted. He thinks they can still be used. He's going to move on this building in the next 10 minutes to take what's inside and use it as leverage against both Mercer and me simultaneously." She looked at the building behind them, at Ruiz and his people, still inside, at the archive room on the second floor with its climate-controlled preservation environment and its 30 years of evidence and its federal receipt number that existed in a system somewhere and had not yet been verified and confirmed by the receiving authority. "The submission," she said. "How long until the federal receipt is confirmed on their end?" Chen's documentation arrives simultaneously. The injunction Gelt filed activates on the confirmed receipt. He looked at the building. 40 minutes. Maybe 30, if the duty officer moves fast. "And Ellery?" 10 minutes. She looked at the building. She looked at Dominic. She thought about the tremor in her right hand in 3 weeks and Yolanda Chen waiting at Northwestern with chelation protocols and the very specific concrete reality that if she did not start treatment in the next few days, the question of what happened to the archive and to Mercer and to Ellery would become academic. She thought about 30 minutes versus 10. She thought about the kind of person she'd been before 6 a.m. this morning and the kind she'd had to become by noon, and the distance between them, and whether the person she'd become had the range for what the next 20 minutes required. Her right hand had stopped trembling again. "Tell me about Ellery," she said. Dominic looked at her with an expression that was not quite the inventory assessment, and not quite the recalibration, and not quite the thing she'd filed away and refused to name. "He's going to come in force," he said. "More than this morning." "I know." She set her bag on the seat beside her. Tell me the layout of the second floor." A beat. The kind that meant he was deciding something. 3 entry points, he said. East stairwell, west stairwell, and a freight elevator on the north face. He looked at the building. If we hold the east stairwell and the freight elevator, the archive room has one approach vector. And Ruiz has how many people inside? 4. 6 including you and me, she said. You're not... Tell me the layout, she said again. He told her. The car door opened and she was out, moving back toward the loading dock with the afternoon light flat and gray above the industrial corridor, and somewhere in the city behind her, Ellery was 10 minutes away with numbers she didn't know and reasons that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the specific ancient economy of men who accumulated leverage and spent it on each other. She had a federal receipt number and an archive and a building and whatever she was now, which was not what she'd been at 6 a.m., which was not, she understood with complete clarity, going back. She went through the loading dock and up the stairs toward the second floor, and the sound of Dominic behind her was steady and close, and somewhere ahead of them, the clock was running, and the next 20 minutes were going to determine whether the 3 weeks she had left were going to mean anything at all. Part 5. Hôi kẹt của kịch bản điện ảnh này được triển khai với dung lượng 4.000 đến 4.500 từ. Bắt đầu trực tiếp từ điểm kết thúc của Part 4. Yêu cầu bắt đầu bằng việc giải quyết triệt để đỉnh điểm cao trào từ phần trước. Cuộc đối đầu cuối cùng phải diễn ra khốc liệt và chân thực, nơi mỗi cái giá phải trả đều trở nên đắt đỏ và không có chiến thắng nào là dễ dàng. Hãy đảm bảo mỗi nút thắt, bí mật và mâu thuẫn từ Part 1 được phơi bày và xử lý trọn vẹn, standalone ending, không để lại bất kỳ chi tiết thua hay mở ra phần tiếp theo. Đảm bảo liên tục xuất hiện cú twist hấp dẫn theo mạch truyền, để gây sự tò mò, gầy can và cuốn hút để thu hút giữ chân người đọc. Duy trì giọng văn mỹ, thô ráp nhưng sâu lắng, tập trung vào sự biến đổi nội tâm của nhân vật sau cơn bão. Hội thoại trong phần này cần mang sức nặng của sự trao đổi, cay đắng và chân thực, lồng ghép tinh tế những thông điệp về bản chất con người và ý chí sinh tồn thông qua hành động thay vì triết lý suông. Hãy kể theo ngôi thứ 3, triển khai chi tiết từng phân cảnh, scene by scene, với nhịp điệu chậm dần về cuối để tạo sự lắng động, tuyệt đối không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng, tiêu đề phụ hay nhắc đến thực thể tôn giáo. Hãy trình bày trực tiếp trong tin nhắn, viết cực kỳ chi tiết từng ánh mắt, cử chỉ và hơi thở cuối cùng của câu chuyện. Nếu đặt giới hạn phản hồi, hãy dừng lại ở một câu rạng rỡ để tôi ra lệnh viết tiếp nhằm đảm bảo độ sâu sắc nhất cho kịch bản lồng tiếng 2 tiếng, chỉ dần bắt buộc. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu nhằm mục đích giải trí, không dựa trên bất kỳ sự kiện hay nhân vật có thật nào. Lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng. Nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dựng giữa câu hay viết nốt câu, đó hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. Or show more. She took the east stairwell with Dominic 3 steps behind her, and the sound of their footfalls on the concrete stairs was the only sound in the building for the first 4 seconds. And then it wasn't, because from somewhere on the north face came the mechanical groan of the freight elevator engaging, and that meant Ellery's people were already here, which meant the 10-minute estimate had been optimistic, which meant the next several minutes were going to be determined by position rather than preparation. Ruiz was at the top of the stairs. He took one look at their faces and turned without a word, and they moved down the corridor toward the archive room with the particular compressed efficiency of people who had stopped deciding and started executing. 2 of Ruiz's men were already at the archive room door. One was at the west stairwell. One she couldn't account for. Freight elevator, she said. Keen, Ruiz said. He's on it. From the north end of the corridor, a sound that was not mechanical. Impact. Something heavy and fast, and then silence. Keen was not on it anymore. The freight elevator opened. She had positioned herself inside the archive room doorway, which was not tactical thinking, she had no tactical training, but was spatial thinking, the same instinct that put her between a patient and a door in a trauma bay. She was thinking about the terminal, about the submission, about 30 minutes versus what was now clearly less than 10. 4 men came out of the freight elevator. She registered them in the way she registered a mass casualty scene, that fast, categorical, not individual. They moved with coordinated efficiency and the specific posture of people who'd done room clearance before, and between her and them in the corridor were Ruiz and one other man, and the arithmetic of that was not favorable. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not something she processed cleanly until afterward, when she had enough distance to assemble the sequence from the fragments her memory had recorded. It was not like film or television. It was faster and louder and more chaotic, and the chaos had a particular texture that was less dramatic than it was exhausting, the way real violence was exhausting, all noise and proximity, and the physical reality of bodies moving hard in a confined space. What she knew in real time was, Ruiz went down. Not dead. She assessed that in the quarter second she had to assess it, the way he fell, the way he caught himself, the position of the injury, but down and out of the immediate equation. The man with him held longer than the numbers suggested he should, which bought something. What it bought was Dominic. She had not, in the hours she'd spent with him, seen Dominic Viscari in the specific context of someone who had spent decades being very dangerous and had simply not been required to demonstrate it in her presence. She saw it now, in the corridor outside the archive room, and what she saw was not dramatic. It was efficient in the same way his stillness was efficient. The same economy applied to a different problem. He moved like someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by violence and had simply learned to be its most functional participant. It was not enough. 4-to-1 was not a ratio that efficiency resolved, and she saw him take the impact against the wall and saw his face in the half-second before he corrected, and knew from the correction and what it cost him that the sutured thigh had been involved, and she made a decision. She stepped out of the doorway. "Stop," she said. It was not a word that should have worked. She was a woman in a jacket with a bag on her shoulder in a corridor, and the men in the corridor had no particular reason to stop, and the word didn't have any force behind it beyond the force of the voice, which was the voice she used in a trauma bay when everything was happening at once, and she needed the room to hear her. They stopped. For 2 seconds, which was 2 more than she'd expected. She held up her phone. Federal case reference 7 Kilo India Romeo Kilo 2026. The archive submission was confirmed 4 minutes ago. This was a lie. She didn't know if it had been confirmed. She was betting on 4 minutes being plausible, given the timing. Every person in this corridor is now a named participant in an active federal case. The building's security system has been transmitting since we entered. This was also not something she could verify. Whatever leverage you came for doesn't exist anymore. One of the 4 men looked at another, a look she recognized. The recalculation, the rapid inventory of what the situation was versus what they'd been told it was. Dominic, against the wall, said nothing. His breathing was audible. The man who appeared to be leading the 4, older, the kind of face that had been outdoors in difficult conditions for most of its life, looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Dominic. "Ellery told us the submission hadn't cleared," he said. "Ellery was working with incomplete information," Dominic said. His voice was level. The pain in it was something you had to know to hear. He was told what Mercer wanted him to believe. A silence. "Mercer used you," Serena said. The man looked back at her. She held his gaze with the same steadiness she held the gaze of a patient who needed to hear something they didn't want to hear. He told Ellery the archives were still actionable so that Ellery would do what Mercer couldn't do himself after the submission. Create enough chaos to discredit the process, destroy the chain of custody, give Mercer's attorneys a procedural argument. She paused. "You're not here to get leverage. You're here to be the reason this doesn't hold up in court." The man said nothing. "Go," she said. Whatever your history with him is, she looked at Dominic, then back, work it out another time. This building is done for both of you tonight. The four men looked at each other with the specific communication of people who had worked together long enough to have a language that didn't require words. Then the lead man looked once more at Dominic, a long look that contained something that was not hostility and was not reconciliation and was specifically its own thing, the complex ledger of a long association. And then he turned and went back to the freight elevator, and the other three went with him. The elevator descended. The corridor was very quiet. Serena went to Ruiz first because he was down and Dominic was upright, and upright took precedence only until she reached Dominic and saw his face clearly and revised that assessment. She put her hand on his arm and he didn't pull away from it, which told her more than his expression did. "Thigh," she said. It held. "That's not what I asked." A breath. "Sutures tore, partially." "Sit down." He sat down against the corridor wall with the specific controlled descent of a man managing pain load, and she crouched in front of him and looked at the leg through the fabric and made the assessment she could make without instruments and without a sterile environment, which was that it needed attention and was not immediately critical and was going to remain not immediately critical if he stopped moving on it. "Ruiz," she said over her shoulder. "I'm fine," Ruiz said from the floor, in the voice of a man who was not entirely fine but was functional, which was the same thing in the current context. She checked her phone. Federal case reference. She opened the submission confirmation and stared at the screen and the timestamp and the status field, which said received, pending confirmation, and had said that since she'd submitted and had not changed. Pending. She sat with that for a moment. Then her phone rang. A number she recognized. Gelt's direct line. She answered. "The duty officer called me," Gelt said, and his voice had the quality of a man who had been waiting for a phone call with the specific tension of someone who couldn't influence the outcome and knew it. "The submission was confirmed 11 minutes ago. The injunction activated." A pause. "It's done, Ms. Vale. The archives are in federal custody. The injunction freezes all Mercer biopharmaceutical assets pending criminal investigation." Another pause. Longer. "I've been waiting to make this call for 30 years. She looked at the corridor. At Ruiz on the floor pressing his palm to his ribs, at Dominic against the wall with his eyes closed and his breathing controlled. At the archive room door behind her, open, the climate-controlled air of 30 years of evidence moving faintly into the corridor. "Thank you, Mr. Gelt," she said. She ended the call. She told them what he'd said. Dominic opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling for a moment and then looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that fit. The federal agents arrived 22 minutes later. In those 22 minutes, several things happened in the specific overlapping way that things happened when a situation was concluding rather than escalating. An ambulance came for Ruiz, who argued about it with the paramedics in the diminishing voice of a man losing the argument to blood loss. A second ambulance came at Serena's insistence for Dominic, who did not argue but looked at her with an expression she had no available category for, and let the paramedics work on his leg in the loading dock with the door open and the afternoon light coming in at a low angle. She sat beside him while they worked, and she didn't look at his face because she was not prepared to look at his face yet, and she thought he understood that. When the federal agents came, she met them in the first-floor corridor, and she answered their questions in the ordered, precise way she answered every question about a complex clinical situation, chronologically, causally, with the supporting documentation physically organized and presented in the sequence that best established the chain of events. She gave them the acquisition agreement, the corporate ownership documents, the monitoring notes with LM at the bottom of each page. She gave them the federal receipt number they already had, and the Gelt injunction filing number, and Yolanda Chen's contact information, and a verbal summary of the compound analysis. She did not give them anything obtained through methods that would create a procedural problem. She did not mention Indiana Avenue. She did not mention the warehouse. She did not specify how the monitoring notes had come into her possession, which was a thing she would address at a later date, in a conversation with an attorney she would choose carefully, and she understood that this was a line she was walking, and she walked it with the full awareness of someone who had spent the morning learning what lines felt like from the inside. The lead federal agent was a woman named Caldwell, who had the face of someone who had been doing this long enough to have stopped being surprised, and had found, on the other side of not being surprised, a kind of flat, professional engagement with the facts as they presented themselves. She listened to Serena with that engagement and asked precise questions and wrote things down in a way that suggested she would remember them anyway, and the writing was a courtesy to the record. At the end of the initial debrief, Caldwell said, "Dr. Mercer is in custody. He was detained at the building's perimeter when our team arrived." Serena absorbed that. "Conrad Hale, an attending physician at Creston Medical. He's been documenting false clinical observations in my patient record for at least 18 months, and Caldwell wrote it down. "Patricia Hale, also at Creston. Administration, patient scheduling. We have her." A pause. "The clinic, Halcyon Wellness. Dissolved this morning by Mercer's own account. You'll want to find the records before they disappear. Already moving on it." Caldwell looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite personal but wasn't entirely procedural. "You need medical attention." "I know," Serena said. "I have a toxicologist waiting." She called Yolanda from the ambulance. Not her ambulance, the second one for Dominic, which she had gotten into because the paramedics had looked at her face and not argued, and because Dominic was lying on the gurney and she was sitting beside him, and neither of them had said anything about this arrangement. Yolanda picked up on the first ring. "Where are you?" Yolanda said, with the voice of a woman who had been holding a compound analysis and a set of treatment protocols and a great deal of controlled professional alarm for several hours. "Ambulance, coming to you." "How are you feeling?" She took inventory. The tremor in her right hand was there, the low-frequency baseline hum. Her head had the slightly overbright quality she'd come to associate with extended adrenaline, followed by its withdrawal. Her legs were tired in the deep way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "I'm functional," she said. "That is not the same as fine." "I know." "Serena, the secondary compound, the accelerant." Yolanda's voice was careful in the way that physicians' voices were careful when they were managing their own response to something. "Your last infusion was 8 days ago. We need to start chelation tonight." "I know." "The neurological damage that exists is reversible," Serena said, "if we start tonight." A pause. "Probably. Largely. There may be some peripheral—" "Yolanda." She looked at the ambulance ceiling. "Tell me when I get there." A breath on the line. "Okay, yes, come straight to the lab." She ended the call and put the phone in her lap and looked at Dominic. He was looking at the ceiling. His color was not good, but his breathing was even, and the paramedic had done something competent with the leg, and the expression on his face was the one she'd learned to read as him being somewhere internal, processing at a speed and in a register that didn't show on the surface. "You lied to them," he said, "in the corridor, about the confirmation." "Yes." "It worked." "It did." She paused. "You didn't correct me." "No." They were quiet for a moment. The ambulance moved through Chicago, and the light through the small rear windows was the particular amber of late afternoon in a city where the sun was getting low. "The men who came," she said, "Ellery's people, you let them walk." "I didn't let them do anything. You did." "You could have stopped me." He turned his head and looked at her from the gurney. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Because you were right, and because I've been in the business of not letting things go for long enough that watching someone let something go was—" He stopped. "Educational." She looked at him. He looked back. The ambulance went over a seam in the road, and the gurney rattled, and neither of them moved. "Your organization," she said. "The federal surveillance. What happens now?" "To me?" "Yes." He returned his gaze to the ceiling. "I've been restructuring for 18 months, removing the elements that warranted the surveillance. Ellery's people leaving was the last significant piece of that." A pause. "What happens now is a long, procedural, tedious process of demonstrating to several agencies that the thing they were surveilling no longer exists in the form they were surveilling." "And does it?" A long pause. "No," he said. "It doesn't." She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure what that said about her after the morning she'd had. But she believed him, and she noted the belief and didn't argue with it. Chelation therapy was not dramatic. It was like most genuinely important medical interventions, technical and slow and unglamorous. An IV line and a carefully calculated protocol, and Yolanda sitting across from her in the lab at 11 p.m. on a Sunday, going through the compound characterization results with the focused energy of a toxicologist who had been waiting to do exactly this for 8 hours. The secondary compound, SUM, the accelerant, had a half-life of 12 days. With chelation beginning now, the accumulation of the primary thallium derivative would begin to decrease measurably within 72 hours. The neurological symptoms would improve more slowly. Some of the peripheral nerve effects might leave traces. Yolanda said might with the professional emphasis of someone who had looked at the full picture and was choosing optimism with eyes open. Serena sat with the IV in her arm and listened, and asked the questions she needed to ask, and accepted the answers with the equanimity of someone who had spent the day surviving things that were worse than this, and had arrived at a functional understanding of what equanimity actually cost. The compound analysis was formally entered into the federal case record the following morning, alongside the archive materials and the monitoring notes and the corporate ownership documentation. The Mercer biopharmaceutical asset freeze held. The patent validity challenges triggered by the illegal trial data entered the regulatory review process that would, over the following months, involve more attorneys and more documentation and more procedural tedium than any single narrative could contain. Conrad Hale was suspended from Creston Medical pending investigation within 24 hours. The false clinical entries in Serena's patient record were flagged by the federal case and reviewed by the hospital board in a process she was not present for and did not need to be present for. Patricia Hale's administrative access was revoked the same day. Serena's own patient record was corrected. It took a surprisingly long time, so 3 formal processes and 2 separate physician reviews, which told her something about how deeply the false entries had been integrated and how carefully they had been designed to be consistent with her documented history. Conrad Hale had been thorough. She gave him that, coldly and without admiration, the way you acknowledge the quality of work that had been used against you. Lucian Mercer was indicted on 14 counts, the first of which was filed 6 weeks after the archive submission. She read about it the way she'd read about the early arrests, the halcyon wellness principles, the corporate architects of the ownership chain, the 2 men who'd worked for the contractor firm that employed Carver, in the specific, slightly detached way of someone who was simultaneously a central figure in the case and also a person with a life to rebuild, patients to see, a department to return to, chelation sessions twice a week, and a right hand that still trembled, but trembled less, measurably less. The improvement visible in her own clinical assessment in the way that gradual improvements were visible only to the person watching for them. She went back to Creston Medical 11 weeks after the Sunday the archive submission cleared. The department had managed without her the way departments managed without anyone, imperfectly, with adjustments, the institutional body compensating for an absence with the practiced efficiency of a system designed to absorb individual variation. Dolores was at the desk. Dolores looked at her when she came through the ambulance bay and said, "Trauma 3 is holding a 32-year-old with a displaced radius." "On it," Serena said, and went. She found the building 6 months after that. It was in Pilsen, a former community health clinic that had been closed for 3 years due to funding gaps. A 2-story brick building with large windows on the south face and a parking lot that could accommodate an ambulance bay if you widened the eastern approach by 12 feet. She stood on the sidewalk outside it on a Tuesday morning in December with her breath visible in the cold air and a folder of architectural assessments under her arm and looked at the building and thought about what it could be. The funding mechanism was complicated in the specific way that funding mechanisms involving recovered criminal assets and federal legal proceedings were complicated, which was to say it required more attorneys and more procedural patience and more documentation. Gelt handled it. He handled it with the energy of a man who had spent 30 years watching a legal obligation sit dormant and was now channeling all of that deferred purpose into what came next. The recovered assets from the Mercer biopharmaceutical criminal proceedings were substantial. The portion designated for victim restitution, which included, under the broad interpretation that the presiding judge applied, community health compensation for the populations most affected by the suppression of adverse event data, was enough. More than enough. She named it the Kerrigan Community Trauma Center, which was not a sentimental decision, but a precise one. Edwin Kerrigan had built something that was used for harm. The name, repurposed, became a record of what happened when you tried to erase the consequences of harm by eliminating the person who'd inherited the right to expose it. The center opened in March. She stood in the entrance on the first day and watched people come through the door and watched her staff, assembled over 3 months with the same precision she'd brought to every professional decision, calibrated for competence and integrity in equal measure, begin the work of seeing them. Her right hand did not tremble that day. It hadn't trembled in 6 weeks. Yolanda had called it a full clinical recovery, which was the most precise available language, and Serena had held the language in her mind for a few days and let it settle into something she could actually feel rather than just assess. She saw Dominic in April. She didn't know she was going to see him. She was across the street from the center in the late afternoon, having walked to the coffee place on the corner that she'd already decided was the best one in the neighborhood, a judgment based on 3 visits and a reliable espresso. And when she came back out with her cup, she saw him on the opposite sidewalk. He was standing at the edge of the center's parking lot, not inside it, not approaching, just standing, at an angle that suggested he'd been watching the building's entrance and had not announced himself and was not going to, which was consistent with everything she'd come to understand about how he operated when he'd decided something. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him, which was in the ambulance in October. The specific quality of tension that she'd learned to read in him, the contained, maintained quality of a man carrying the weight of a very large and very complex structure, was different. Not absent, but different, like a load-bearing wall that had been reconfigured rather than removed. He looked at her across the street, and she looked at him. She crossed. He watched her come without moving. When she reached him, she stood 2 feet away with her coffee cup in her right hand, the right hand steady, and looked at his face, and he looked at hers, and the look had in it the entirety of a day in October that neither of them had fully processed in any conversation because there had been federal agents and medical protocols and legal proceedings and the basic infrastructure of continuing to exist, which had consumed the available bandwidth. "You could have called," she said. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I didn't know what I was calling about yet." She looked at the center behind her, at the windows with their south-facing light, at the door with the name above it. She looked back at him. "Do you know now?" she said. He looked at the building. Something moved in his face that was not the inventory assessment, and was not the recalibration, and was not the almost smile that had never quite completed in the warehouse on a Sunday morning 6 months ago. It was something quieter than any of those things, and harder to read, and she let it be hard to read because she understood that some things resolve slowly. "I know that I came to see whether what you built was what you said it would be," he said. "When you described it, in the car." He paused. "It is." She thought about the car. October, the ambulance, the late amber light. She thought about everything she'd said in that car, and what she'd been at the time she said it, and what she was standing on a sidewalk in April with a steady right hand. "The proceedings," she said. "The restructuring. How is that going?" Slowly. A pause. "Correctly." She believed that too. She noted the belief, the same way she'd noted it in October, and let it stand without explanation. "The monitoring notes," she said. "The ones with his initials. The federal case used them. I was never asked about the chain of custody." "No." He held her gaze. "You won't be." She had suspected that. She had also decided that it was the kind of thing she was going to let stand, which was itself a thing she'd needed the 6 months to arrive at, not because it was comfortable or because it resolved cleanly, but because the alternative was a procedural argument that would have given Mercer's defense attorneys exactly the opening they'd spent months looking for, and the 47 documented people deserved a cleaner conclusion than that. "The Halcyon medical director," she said. "Alana Fox. She pled." "I know." "She gave testimony on the compound synthesis. The modified lipid carrier. She didn't develop it. She was given it and told it was an immune modulation protocol. She believed it." Serena had read the testimony. She'd read it twice. "I believed her." Dominic said nothing. He was not the kind of person who offered comfort as a reflex, which she had known since the first conversation in the warehouse, and which she found consistently to be one of the things about him she trusted most. Patricia Hale pled also, Serena said, testified against Conrad. A pause. He recruited her first. She brought him in afterward. She held her coffee cup with both hands, feeling the warmth of it. 2 years of marriage before she found out what she'd helped him do. Did that change anything for you? She thought about it honestly. No, she said. And yes, it changed the shape of it, not the weight. He nodded, once, in the way that meant he understood rather than agreed. They stood on the sidewalk with the center behind her and the April light doing what April light did in Chicago, arriving as if surprised to be there, thin and earnest after a long winter. A woman came out of the center's entrance carrying a child's coat and talking on her phone. A delivery vehicle moved down the block. The neighborhood did what neighborhoods did, continuous in particular, indifferent to the two people standing at its edge. Ruiz, she said, recovered. Good. She meant it. She'd thought about Ruiz in the months between October and now more than she'd expected to. She'd thought about Keene, who had been taken down at the freight elevator and had a fractured clavicle and 3 cracked ribs and had not, she'd been told through channels she'd decided not to examine too carefully, sustained anything permanent. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask. The night in the ER, when you came in, you'd been shot outside a hospital where I work. She looked at him directly. Was that coincidence? He held her gaze. What do you think? I think you'd been surveilling the clinic. I think you were in the area because you were already looking at the ownership chain. She paused. I think the shooting was coincidence. I think where you ended up was not entirely. Something crossed his face that was the almost smile again, and this time it completed slightly further than before, and she filed that away in the category of things she was going to let be what they were without requiring them to be something else. Ruiz had flagged Halcyon 4 days before, he said. As a subsidiary in the ownership chain of a business I had a separate interest in. The investigation was already running. A pause. I was shot 2 blocks from the clinic. The ER was the nearest trauma center. Another pause. Both things are true. She looked at him. And the fingernails. I'd seen it before. I knew what it meant. Something in his voice that was flat in the way of things that had weight rather than the way of things that lacked it. I also... He stopped. I noticed you before I noticed the fingernails. In the ER, the way you worked. He looked at the center. That's also true. She stood with that for a moment. Okay, she said. He looked back at her. Okay? She finished her coffee. The cup was paper, standard, the kind she'd drunk from in hospital break rooms for 11 years, and she looked at it for a moment and then looked at the trash can at the corner and made the throw, which she'd been making all her life without thinking about it. But this time she was aware of her right hand releasing cleanly, steadily, without the tremor that had been her constant companion for 14 months, and had become, in its absence, its own kind of evidence of what the last 6 months had been. She looked at Dominic. Come inside, she said. I'll show you what we're doing. He looked at the center entrance, at the name above the door, at her. Yes, he said. They crossed the parking lot together in the April light, and she pushed open the door and held it, and he went through, and behind them the door swung closed on the street and the afternoon and everything that had happened in the particular violent, costly, irreversible sequence that had led from a rainy night in an ER to this, which was not a resolution so much as it was a terrain, new, hard-earned, still being mapped. And she walked into the building she'd built from the wreckage of what had been done to her and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the full weight of something she hadn't had a name for and now did. Not safety, not victory. Something quieter and more durable than either. Something worth protecting.